Time, to the Vikings, was not a polite, well-behaved sequence of months printed neatly on a refrigerator calendar. It was a single looming question that shaped every task, every conversation, every argument, and every sigh of exhaustion. How close are we to winter? Their entire year orbited around this cold inevitability like a moon around a planet. If something needed doing, it wasn't measured in days. It was measured in urgency before the snow arrived to ruin everything. Hello, travellers. Before winter closes in on the Viking world, take a moment to like and subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from, and whether it's warm or cold where you are as this story begins. Now let's begin. Forget birthdays, feast days, coronations, or anniversaries. Those were secondary. Winter was the only event that mattered. And unfortunately it RSVP'd yes every single year. Vikings might not have had clocks, but they had a dangerously accurate internal countdown that started the moment the last frost melted. You have approximately one warm season to prepare before misery resumes. This wasn't paranoia, it was logistics. Northern climates didn't offer generous growing seasons or mild winters. The weather didn't gently cool down like a modern cafe air conditioner. No, Viking winter arrived like a tax audit, sudden, unforgiving, and ready to expose every mistake you made earlier in the year. That meant every decision, from when to harvest barley to when to repair a roof beam, had a single criterion. Will winter destroy us if we procrastinate? And usually the answer was yes. Planning ahead became a cultural instinct. Viking society didn't reward spontaneity unless it involved running from a bear. A farmer who planted late, harvested late, or forgot to bring in the livestock before the storms hit wasn't seen as relaxed or free-spirited. He was seen as going to be very cold and very hungry. Entire families depended on everyone understanding the schedule, especially because winter didn't negotiate. If you begged for one more week of decent weather, winter said no. If you insisted you just needed a single sunny day to finish drying the hay, winter said no. If you politely asked for 30 more minutes of daylight, winter said, absolutely not. And also the sun is leaving early today. This is why Viking society developed a kind of seasonal tunnel vision. Spring meant preparing fields, not strolling among flowers. Summer meant repairing everything winter had damaged, which was usually everything. Autumn meant panicking productively. And winter, well, winter meant hoping all those earlier decisions were correct. The entire rhythm of life was so deeply tied to the coming cold that even their mythology reflected seasonal anxiety. Ragnarok, the great cosmic doom, was imagined as an endless winter. Because for Vikings, the worst possible future was simply more winter. The year wasn't a circle for Vikings. It was a slope that got steeper the closer you got to the final months. Each week that passed felt like a step toward the edge. If you asked a Viking when he planned to build a new fence, he might shrug and say before winter. And if you asked when before winter, he would stare at you as if you'd asked him to explain gravity. There was no schedule more precise than before winter. If it wasn't done by then, well, nature would kindly remove the need for a fence by killing everything it was supposed to contain. This constant countdown shaped behaviour in ways that baffled outsiders. Trading voyages were scheduled around it. Marriage negotiations took winter preparation into account, and even storytelling traditions aligned with the cold months. Vikings treated time like an adversary they needed to outsmart every year. They weren't chasing prosperity, they were chasing readiness. And readiness wasn't optional. If the harvest failed or repairs were delayed, winter became an unforgiving judge. Every forgotten task from July returned in January like a haunting reminder that procrastination was a luxury enjoyed only by people who lived in warmer climates. Planning wasn't just a habit, it was a survival reflex. The Viking year was a contract, and winter enforced the terms. So while other cultures marked their calendars with festivals, milestones, and royal events, Vikings lived in a constant state of seasonal awareness. The calendar wasn't about celebration, it was about preparation. A Viking didn't say, next year we'll have more barley. He said, if the gods are merciful, next winter will not be catastrophic. Their optimism had limits, and those limits were roughly the length of a single daylight-deprived winter afternoon. Because in the Viking world, the future wasn't a timeline, it was a finish line, and your first, second, and third priority was making sure you reached spring to see it. If you've ever complained about a slightly overcast Monday morning, congratulations, you would not have survived a Viking winter. In the far north, winter didn't simply bring cold, it stole the sun. Daylight shrank until it became an endangered species. The world dimmed, shadows stretched, and entire communities learned what it truly meant to live in the dark, not poetically, but literally, inconveniently, visually dark. Forget modern, short days. Vikings measured daylight on a scale somewhere between barely and the gods are messing with us. In some regions, the sun crawled above the horizon for just long enough to remind people it still existed. A Viking could blink and miss noon entirely. Children sometimes asked what colour the sky really was, and adults had to answer from memory. It wasn't gloomy exactly. It was a 6-month cosmic prank. This lack of sunlight influenced almost everything. People woke up in the dark, worked in the dark, ate in the dark, argued in the dark, and tried not to trip over livestock in the dark. Daily routines became a guessing game. Is it morning? Is it afternoon? Is it the same night we were just in? Winter timekeeping required intuition, not accuracy. You didn't know what hour it was, but you did know that whatever the hour, it was probably dark. And with darkness came a kind of emotional fog. Vikings didn't have the vocabulary for seasonal depression, but they had the symptoms down perfectly. Energy dipped, tempers shortened, and motivation wandered off until spring. Productivity didn't disappear. It simply slowed to the pace of someone half asleep, wrapped in wool, waiting for a sun that refused to show up. People worked by firelight when they could, which meant squinting constantly, misplacing tools and occasionally hammering the wrong thing. Relationships also felt winter's shadow. When families were trapped indoors for months sharing close quarters and minimal personal space, darkness amplified every mood. A simple disagreement about where to store dried fish could explode into a household drama. If someone sighed too loudly, a neighbour might interpret it as a personal critique. Darkness didn't make people irrational, it just made everything feel heavier, as if emotions gained winter weight. Light, real daylight, was precious. When the sun finally made a cameo appearance, everyone reacted as if a celebrity had randomly walked into their farmyard. Work stopped. People stared dramatically toward the horizon. Someone might whisper, "I knew you'd come back." Elders in the community became the keepers of sunlight folklore. They could recount ancient stories of summers where light lasted so long you could finish chores at midnight and still see your own disappointment in the livestock. But while the sun was gone, life had to continue. Fire became the substitute sun, not in power, but in morale. Every household spent winter chasing brightness. Candles, torches, oil lamps, hearth fires. A well-tended fire was more than heat. It was mood management. A dimly lit longhouse felt like a cave of despair. A brightly burning one felt like a temporary victory over cosmic darkness. Vikings didn't do self-care rituals, but they absolutely practiced stare at the fire until you feel something again. Darkness also reshaped Viking imagination. Myths grew richer in winter, not because people were creative, but because shadows did half the work. When light is scarce, the world beyond your door becomes a mystery, one filled with spirits, giants, omens, and maybe the neighbour's goat. But you couldn't be sure. Night wasn't simply the absence of sunlight. It was a living landscape. You stayed inside because of the cold, and you stayed inside because you didn't want to discover which shape near the fence was an elf and which was a hungry wolf. Social gatherings took on new weight in the dark months. Sharing stories, songs, and jokes wasn't just entertainment, it was survival for the mind. A well-told saga could lift spirits for hours. A poorly told saga could make everyone question whether spring was worth waiting for. Humour became both shield and medicine. When you're surrounded by darkness for 18 hours a day, a good joke is basically light therapy by other means. And then there was sleep, or rather, the winter attempt at sleep. Darkness might suggest restful slumber, but Vikings didn't sleep more. They simply slept differently. Bodies tried to follow the long night rhythm while responsibilities insisted on waking at inconvenient times. People dozed in segments, napped when the fire allowed, and accepted that a full night's rest belonged to summer. The circadian rhythm didn't just break, it packed up and emigrated south. The darkness shaped Viking psychology in lasting ways. Their worldview tilted toward realism, practicality, and a certain no-nonsense acceptance of hardship. When half the year feels like midnight, optimism becomes something you ration carefully. Hope had value, but only in doses small enough to fit between chores. The emotional landscape of winter wasn't bleak. It was patient, steady, and quietly determined, much like the people who endured it. Because when the sun disappears for most of the season, you learn a powerful truth. Winter doesn't just freeze the world, it dims it. And the people who survive it learn to make their own light. In the Viking world, cold wasn't a temperature, it was a predator. It stalked the living, crept into homes, crawled under clothing, and attacked the body like an enemy with infinite patience. Vikings didn't brace against winter winds because they were uncomfortable. They braced because the wrong decision, one poorly planned errand, one misjudged hour outdoors, could mean frostbite, illness, or simply never coming home again. Cold wasn't background weather. It was an active, daily threat that shaped survival on a cellular level. There were days so cold that breath didn't just mist. It fell out of the air like tiny ghosts. Days where leather stiffened into uncooperative boards, where ropes froze solid, where metal tools bit fingers harder than the work you were trying to do with them. Vikings learned early that the environment was not their friend. It wasn't even neutral. Winter wanted things, and it took them without apology. Warmth, livestock, firewood, and occasionally entire human fingers. Frostbite was not a theoretical danger. It was a familiar, ugly reality. Toes and fingers were the first to go numb. Then the skin turned pale, then hard, then dead. Children learned the warning signs before they learned their own ancestry. Adults regularly checked their extremities during outdoor work, not for comfort, but to ensure they still existed. There were no thermal gloves, no heat packs, no high-tech insulated boots. Clothing helped, yes, but cold had a way of slipping past wool and fur like a thief testing every window. And then there was hypothermia, the slow, deceptive killer. Vikings didn't use the word, but they absolutely understood its mechanics. Get too cold, stay too cold, and your own body will start shutting down. Wet clothing, whether from snow, sleet, or an accidental splash at the shoreline, was a serious emergency. A man who fell into icy water didn't worry about embarrassment. He worried about not surviving the next hour. In some cases, the cold didn't even need water's help. One unexpected windstorm could drain a person's heat faster than they could generate it, leaving them drowsy, confused, and dangerously quiet. Silence, in winter, was ominous. The cold also assaulted the work itself. Tools cracked, warped, or froze to surfaces. An axe left outside overnight transformed into a frost-coated insult. A wooden bucket might split from pressure. Even simple tasks like tying knots or gripping a handle were complicated by numb fingers that no longer obeyed instructions. Vikings didn't pause to admire winter landscapes. They were too busy negotiating with physics. Every outdoor task required strategy. How long it would take, how much warmth it would cost, and whether the reward justified the danger. Animals felt the threat just as sharply. Livestock could freeze in storms if not brought in early enough. Water troughs transformed into solid blocks, so every morning involved smashing ice instead of calmly tending the herd. Weak or sick animals didn't stand a chance. A single harsh night could wipe out months of planning and food security. The cold wasn't selective. It killed whatever was easiest to claim. Even the act of breathing changed. The air sliced down the throat like a blade of ice. Noses ran constantly, then froze, then ran again. Beards turned into frosted sculptures, stiff and glittering. A Viking man might appear heroic from a distance, but he was mostly a collection of icicles dressed in wool, powered by stubbornness. The home, sturdy as it was, could only do so much. Walls blocked wind, yes, but cold seeped through everything eventually. A fire could warm the air, but it rarely warmed the corners. Beds were cold when you entered them, and cold again when you left. The cold didn't politely stay outdoors. It snuck in the moment you weren't looking. If you put your feet on the floor in the morning and didn't immediately regret your life choices, congratulations, you were hallucinating. This relentless chill shaped Viking decision-making in surprisingly sophisticated ways. Travel wasn't simply limited by daylight. It was limited by the body's tolerance for exposure. Debating whether to visit a neighbour 3 miles away wasn't a social question. It was a medical risk assessment. Hunting required groups, not for teamwork, but for recovery time and shared warmth. Even arguments changed tone in winter. People conserved energy, spoke less, and gestured minimally, because moving too much let precious heat escape into the void. It also shaped identities. A Viking who could endure harsh conditions was admired, not for bravery, but for reliability. Winter filtered out carelessness. Resilience wasn't a heroic trait. It was a basic requirement. A man who survived a winter storm earned respect because he had demonstrated control over himself, not the environment. You could not conquer winter. That idea would have made Vikings laugh or cry or both. Winter was a fact of life. You didn't defeat it. You survived it, hopefully intact. And yet, despite its brutality, cold became part of the Viking mindset. It taught caution, discipline, and humility. It reminded every person, every year, that nature didn't care about your plans. It created a psychological toughness rooted not in aggression, but in awareness. Vikings didn't walk into storms thinking, I am strong. They walked into storms thinking, I know exactly how dangerous this is. Survival was never an accident, because winter didn't treat the cold as weather. It treated it as a weapon, and every Viking grew up learning how not to stand in its way. For Vikings, food wasn't a daily concern. It was a year-long strategy game with extremely high stakes. Winter didn't let anyone figure it out later. If food wasn't prepared before the cold arrived, there was no last-minute shopping, no emergency feast, no spontaneous stew. Winter shelves didn't care about your cravings. Whatever you had in storage in November was exactly what you'd still be chewing on in February, probably wishing you had harvested one more bag of barley instead of taking that relaxing afternoon nap in midsummer. Viking winter cuisine wasn't flexible. It was a contractual obligation. Everything edible had to be secured during the warmer seasons. The land produced generously only in narrow windows, and Vikings responded by using those months like frantic contestants on a cooking show where the timer was ticking and failure meant starvation. They sowed, weeded, harvested, milled, dried, and preserved with an urgency that modern grocery shoppers will never understand. You didn't casually grow vegetables. You fought a yearly battle to gather as much as possible before the snow declared the competition over. When winter came, crops no longer grew. That meant every carrot, every grain of barley, every dried fish, every stored cabbage represented decisions made long before the cold arrived. Food wasn't just nutrition. It was evidence of your summer behavior. If you worked hard, your pantry reflected it. If you slacked off, your stomach reflected that instead. And there was no hiding the truth. Hunger was winter's auditor. Harvest season was the core of survival. Grains like barley, rye, and oats were essential not only for bread and porridge, but also for brewing ale, because nothing softened winter quite like a drink that made you temporarily forget winter existed. Vegetables that could be preserved, turnips, cabbages, onions, were gathered as if the gods themselves had demanded tribute. Nothing fresh remained fresh for long, so Vikings relied on storage methods that turned their homes into miniature ecosystems of drying racks, smoke haze, and barrels filled with food that hopefully wouldn't rot. Preservation was a science, although Vikings didn't call it that. They simply knew what worked. Fish and meat were salted, smoked, or dried until they were hard enough to survive a fall from a roof. Grain was kept dry and elevated to avoid moisture and pests. Dairy was converted into butter or stored as cheese, dense, durable, and often intimidating. Fermentation wasn't an experimental hobby. It was one of the most important survival techniques known to northern humans. If something could be fermented, it probably was. Every preserved item that made it into storage was a small victory. But winter didn't care how many jars or sacks you had. It cared whether you had enough. Food stocks were monitored constantly, counted and recounted because miscalculations were deadly. A mild winter might leave you with leftovers. A harsh winter could empty your shelves long before the first hint of spring. And if your supplies ran low, you didn't simply borrow more. You faced a season of smaller meals, cautious rationing, and constant anxiety. Winter meals had their own rhythm. Breakfast might be leftover porridge, cold, thick, and discouraging. Lunch could be dried fish, which didn't spoil but also didn't bring joy. Dinner was often stew made from whatever refused to die in storage. If you were lucky, the flavour varied slightly depending on which root vegetable fell into the pot that day. Variety wasn't the goal. Calories were. Winter food didn't strive to impress. It strived to keep you alive. Communities prepared collectively as well. Families supported one another because winter didn't just target individuals, it targeted entire villages. If one household failed to store enough food, neighbours might help, not out of indulgence, but because hunger spread quickly and desperate people were a threat to everyone's survival. Shared labour in summer led to shared security in winter. Vikings didn't call this mutual aid. They simply understood that starving neighbours made terrible long-term company. Livestock planning played a crucial role too. Winter didn't provide enough grass, so animals required their own food stores. That meant hay, fodder, and carefully rationed feed. Animals that wouldn't survive winter, or that the community chose not to feed through the cold months, were slaughtered in late autumn. This ensured fresh meat at the beginning of winter and reduced the number of mouths to feed afterward. It was practical, efficient, and slightly depressing, but also completely necessary. Hunting was possible in winter, but extremely unreliable. Tracking could be easier in snow, but the cold punished anyone who lingered outdoors too long. Game might migrate, disappear, or be too lean to provide real nourishment. Vikings didn't depend on hunting to feed a village, not because they lacked skill, but because they respected risk. Winter food needed to be inside the house before winter arrived. All of this shaped Viking attitudes toward food. Waste was unthinkable. Experimentation was rare. Meals were predictable, but predictability was its own comfort. You didn't eat to enjoy, you ate to continue. And yet, even within these limits, meals had meaning. They symbolized foresight, discipline, and communal effort. They reflected the entire year's worth of work compressed into each bite. Because once the snow fell, the menu wasn't a suggestion, it was a reminder of what you did or didn't do when the sun was still warm. If modern people worry about overeating during the holidays, Vikings worried about undereating for half the year. Starvation wasn't a dramatic, unexpected crisis. It was a familiar seasonal guest who showed up every winter, refused to leave, and ate more than anyone wanted it to. Hunger didn't arrive suddenly. It crept in slowly, tightening its grip as storage barrels emptied and snowdrifts piled higher. Winter hunger wasn't a hypothetical fear. It was baked into the psychology, planning, and even the social behaviours of Viking communities. The truth was simple. Everyone expected to be hungry at some point. The only real question was how hungry and how soon. Food storage was always carefully calculated, but calculations were optimistic at best. Families knew that no matter how well they prepared, winter had a way of demanding more than they wanted to give. A slightly longer cold season, a poor harvest the previous summer, or an unexpected illness could tilt the balance from tight rations to creative rationing, the culinary art of pretending small portions were intentional. Portion sizes changed drastically as winter progressed. What began as reasonably sized meals in early winter slowly shrank as supplies dwindled. A ladle of stew in January might look completely different by March, not because the recipe changed, but because the pot suddenly seemed bottomless in all the wrong ways. Eating became less about satisfaction and more about strategy. You weren't trying to get full, you were trying to stretch the food across enough days to keep everyone alive until spring. This created an intricate social dance inside households. Someone always monitored the food levels, someone always suggested modest portions. And someone, usually a hungry teenager, always regretted volunteering to help check storage because staring at dwindling supplies felt like staring into the abyss. Families learned to eat with awareness, which is a poetic way of saying they stared at each other meaningfully whenever someone took a second helping. Sharing, too, was part of the equation. Viking communities knew that starvation in one house could ripple outward. A poor family might receive help from neighbours, not because charity was fashionable, but because desperation was dangerous. Hunger made people unpredictable, irritable, and bold. Keeping everyone at least slightly fed meant keeping social order intact. Food sharing wasn't about generosity, it was about survival as a group, and when sharing wasn't enough, communities relied on winter strategies that were old, clever, and occasionally grim. For example, fishing in icy waters was possible but risky. A successful winter catch might boost a household's supplies temporarily, but the danger often outweighed the reward. Foraging was nearly impossible. Snow buried everything, and even if you found something edible, it probably needed to be thawed with more firewood than it was worth. By late winter, even animals were lean, which made hunting a gamble rather than a solution. Psychologically, hunger became a background feeling, an uninvited companion that followed people through their daily routines. It influenced mood, conversation, and decision-making. People moved slower, conserved energy, and rarely wasted effort on anything that didn't directly support survival. Complaining was normal, but complaining too loudly was frowned upon, as if speaking hunger into existence might somehow make it worse. There was a stoic acceptance of discomfort, but also an honest understanding that hunger shaped every thought. Winter hunger also taught restraint. If you found a forgotten sack of grain or a hidden stash of dried fish behind a storage barrel, you didn't celebrate with a feast. You rationed it meticulously, stretching it like a precious treasure. Every meal was a calculation, every bite was a reminder of the month still to endure. The idea of fullness was almost mythical, something children believed in but adults treated as a summer memory. Despite the hardship, there was an odd unity in hunger. People became more aware of the value of every ingredient. A single onion could flavour a pot and lift morale. A bit of butter could transform a meal into something memorable. A rare piece of meat might be saved for someone sick, weak, or elderly. Food became emotional currency. Giving someone a larger portion was an act of deep respect. Refusing extra food was an act of selflessness. The emotional weight of food in winter was unmistakable. The final weeks before spring were the most difficult. This was the annual period known unofficially as hope versus reality, when households tried to make dwindling supplies last until the first signs of warmth returned. Old stories from elders became warnings wrapped in wisdom, tales of winters so severe that people boiled leather or ate bark. These stories weren't meant to frighten, they were meant to remind younger generations that starvation was not a distant possibility, but a historical memory kept fresh through tradition. And yet, this regular brush with hunger didn't break Viking culture. It shaped it. It forged a mindset rooted in endurance, discipline, and respect for preparation. It taught patience, resilience, and acceptance of hardship without melodrama. Vikings didn't fear hunger because fear wasted energy. They simply adapted, as they did every year. Because in Viking winter, you didn't measure your meals. You measured your survival, not in calories, but in weeks left before spring. To a Viking, animals weren't companions. They were winter insurance policies with legs. Livestock represented warmth, food, clothing, tools, and in some cases, the difference between starving in February and celebrating in May. Winter turned every animal into a strategic asset, and households treated them accordingly. It wasn't sentimentality that dictated which animals came indoors at night, it was economics. A good cow was worth more than a dozen warriors when snow started piling against the walls. Summer livestock behaved like, well, livestock. They grazed freely, produced milk, and occasionally caused chaos by wandering into spaces they didn't belong. But once winter arrived, the dynamic changed drastically. The needs of the animals and the humans merged. Everyone became part of a tightly managed system designed to survive the cold months together. The barn wasn't a distant structure. Often, animals lived in the same longhouse as the family, separated by a wooden partition, or sometimes nothing but a sense of mutual respect. Bringing animals indoors wasn't an act of affection. It was a simple calculation. Warm animals stay alive, and alive animals keep families alive. A cow that froze in a blizzard wasn't just a tragic loss. It was the sudden disappearance of milk, butter, potential calves, and the future of the household's food security. Losing a cow in winter was like losing a year's worth of planning. Vikings didn't weep over their animals, they panicked. And then there were sheep and goats, the walking winter wardrobes. Their wool, milk, and meat were essential, and they were small enough to fit comfortably in indoor spaces. They often huddled near the walls, contributing warmth in a way that was both practical and slightly awkward. Imagine waking up in the middle of the night and realizing a goat was staring at you. For Vikings, that was normal. For the goat, it was Tuesday. But the emotional boundary was clear. These animals were valued, necessary, and carefully managed, but not coddled. A Viking child didn't grow up naming their sheep Snowflake or Fluffy. Naming something destined for the stew pot created unnecessary drama. Names created relationships. Relationships created grief. Grief didn't help anyone survive winter, so emotional restraint was a practical skill, taught early and reinforced often. Slaughter decisions were not made lightly. Autumn was the season of difficult choices, when households evaluated which animals they could feed through winter and which they couldn't. Keeping too many animals meant spreading food too thin across humans and livestock alike. Keeping too few meant less milk, less wool, fewer breeding animals, and fewer options next year. Families gathered, debated, and often relied on the wisdom of elders to determine the exact right number of animals to sustain. Those that couldn't be fed became essential winter resources. Meat was preserved and stored, hides were processed into clothing and footwear, bones were carved into tools and needles, and sinew became strong thread for repairing winter gear. Nothing went to waste. Not because Vikings were environmentally conscious, but because every part of an animal was practical. Even the fat was precious, used in cooking, lamps, and waterproofing clothing. In winter, every scrap had a purpose, and every purpose helped someone survive. Caring for animals during winter was a job that never ended. Morning and evening chores became rituals repeated with religious consistency. Water had to be broken from ice. Feed had to be rationed. Bedding had to be kept clean enough that sickness didn't spread. A sick animal in winter was a serious threat because medical solutions were limited, and replacement livestock wasn't exactly roaming the snowy hills waiting to be adopted. Animals also provided warmth, not metaphorically but physically. Their body heat contributed to the indoor temperature. Vikings understood this instinctively, even if they didn't calculate BTUs. A longhouse with animals was warmer than one without, and that meant less firewood was burned. Firewood was precious. Animals, by their mere existence, reduced the household's need to chop more logs in freezing weather. A cow didn't just produce milk, it produced degrees. Of course, sharing a home with livestock came with challenges. The smell alone was a commitment. Noise was constant. Goats argued with each other. Sheep shuffled around like wool-covered ghosts. Cows had opinions. Families learned to sleep through it all because complaining didn't make the animals leave, and asking them politely was pointless. Besides, the animals weren't guests. They were part of the winter survival team, and winter changed their behavior too. Animals became calmer, more still, and more dependent. Food was predictable, shelter was warm, and wandering into a storm was discouraged by everyone involved. They settled into the rhythm of winter life the same way humans did. Eat, rest, stay close, endure. Survival wasn't individual, it was shared. In the spring, the relationship shifted again. As snow melted, animals returned to the outdoors. Calves were born, milk production increased, and sheep lost their heavy winter coats. But winter was always the defining season, the one that determined which animals made it to spring, and which families had the resources to start the year strong. Because in the Viking world, livestock weren't symbols of wealth. They were partners in survival. And if the cow stayed warm, then, just maybe, so did the family. A Viking home wasn't designed to impress guests. It was designed to survive winter without collapsing, freezing, or smoking its inhabitants like salmon strips. The longhouse, the architectural backbone of Viking life, wasn't a cosy cottage with scenic windows and charming hearth arrangements. It was a fortress against the cold, a heat trap, a livestock hotel, and a communal sleeping chamber all fused into one long, low structure, built with every intention of outsmarting nature. At first glance, a longhouse might look simple. Long, narrow, sloping roof, thick walls, one central hall. But every feature existed because winter forced the design. These buildings were engineered not around aesthetics, but around the cold reality that warmth was the single most important domestic resource, more important than privacy, comfort, or the ability to breathe clean air. Thick walls were the first line of defense. Vikings used turf, logs, or wattle and daub, depending on local materials. Turf walls, for example, were absurdly effective at insulating heat. They were basically giant earthen blankets wrapped around the family. These walls didn't just block wind, they absorbed it like a stubborn, immovable shield. A longhouse built correctly could withstand storms so fierce they erased footprints within seconds. Of course, thick walls also meant dim interiors. Windows were tiny or non-existent because windows were traitors. They let heat escape. Natural light was a luxury only summer could afford. The roof played its own critical role, high enough to let smoke rise, low enough to conserve heat. Winter didn't leave room for architectural flair. A decorative roofline was pointless if it dumped warm air into the sky. The roof was steep to shed heavy snow before it collapsed the structure, and it extended low to keep interior warmth where it belonged. Inside, pressed tightly onto the heads of the people trying to survive. Inside the longhouse, the first thing you'd notice, after tripping over something or someone, was the heat-based interior design philosophy. Comfort didn't rank in the top 10 priorities. The hearth was placed in the centre of the hall, not for ambience, but because spreading heat evenly was the only way to prevent someone freezing to death in a corner. Fire wasn't a decorative feature. It was the beating heart of the house. But central hearths came with a cost: smoke. A properly functioning longhouse was warm. A perfectly functioning longhouse was warm and smoky. Smoke escaped through a vent in the roof or through gaps in the thatch. But escape is a generous word. The smoke lingered, swirled, collected, and hung in layers like a moody indoor fog. Vikings inhaled so much smoke every winter that their lungs probably hosted miniature fireplaces of their own. When a stranger visited, you greeted them with a handshake, a seat near the hearth, and a gentle cough. Ventilation was a compromise. Too much smoke was miserable. but too much ventilation let cold air rush inside. So families accepted a level of smoky atmosphere that would have modern building inspectors fainting. A well-smoked longhouse wasn't a failure, it was a badge of winter efficiency. The floor plan revolved around practicality. The central aisle provided access and workspace. Raised platforms lined the sides where families slept, ate, and stored essential items. These platforms were slightly elevated to protect against cold from the ground and to provide a buffer from wandering livestock hooves. Bedding wasn't luxurious. Wool blankets, furs, and straw layers, but it kept people alive, which was all anyone could ask from winter bedding. Privacy simply did not exist. Not in winter. The longhouse became an enforced community chamber. Children, parents, elders, animals, everyone existed in a shared warmth bubble. You overheard everything. You smelled everything. You learned to sleep through everything. Arguments, snoring, coughing, animal noises, and the unmistakable aroma of life were woven into the fabric of winter living. A Viking didn't grow up learning the concept of personal space. They grew up learning the concept of please don't roll over onto the goat. Crowding wasn't a flaw. It was the architecture's most useful feature. Every body added heat to the room. Dozens of humans and animals living together created a microclimate that defied the snowstorms raging outside. Your home wasn't a quiet retreat. It was a survival engine powered by collective body warmth. Even conversations generated heat, though probably not enough to justify arguing on purpose. Storage was squeezed into every available nook. Tools hung from beams, food tucked into corners, clothing draped over poles to dry. Nothing wasted space because surviving winter required efficiency. The longhouse interior was an organized chaos, functional, cramped, and undeniably alive. Even the soundscape was engineered by necessity. You didn't expect silence. Winter houses hummed with the constant soundtrack of survival. Crackling fire, shifting animals, murmured voices, coughing, the occasional clatter of tools. Sleep wasn't peaceful, it was simply necessary. But despite the smoke, the crowding, and the absolute lack of personal boundaries, the longhouse had one undeniable quality. It worked. It kept families alive through winters that could otherwise erase communities from existence. Every architectural compromise served a purpose. Every structural choice reflected an understanding of what winter demanded. Comfort could wait for summer, warmth could not. And in the Viking world, that logic built homes that turned cold months from a death sentence into something survivable, if not entirely pleasant. If you want to understand Viking winter survival, forget the axes, the ships, the sagas, and the fur-lined cloaks. Focus on one thing: fire. Fire wasn't a household feature, it was the household's boss. It ran the schedule, dictated the chores, controlled the mood of the room, and decided whether a family lived, suffered, or froze. Fire wasn't atmospheric, it wasn't romantic. It was the single most crucial technology in a world where winter wasn't a season. It was an environmental bully. To keep a Viking longhouse warm, fire needed to burn constantly. A hearth that went out unexpectedly wasn't an inconvenience, it was an emergency. Reigniting fire during a winter storm wasn't guaranteed, especially if fuel was low or the air was too damp to coax a flame. Losing fire could mean frost creeping into the home faster than blankets and bodies could fight it. No Viking ever said, "We'll relight it in a couple of hours." They treated the flame like a living creature that demanded attention, respect, and frequent feeding. And feeding it was a job that never ended. Fuel gathering consumed enormous amounts of time. Wood didn't magically appear next to the hearth. Family members chopped it, hauled it, dried it, stacked it, and guarded it with the same suspicion usually reserved for valuables. Firewood was gold that you burned one armful at a time. Too much wood used early in winter spelled trouble later. Too little meant shivering through nights that already lasted longer than anyone wanted. Different wood served different purposes. Softwood was easy to ignite but burned quickly. Hardwood burned longer but required more effort to chop. Vikings balanced these like skilled accountants, calculating heat output in their heads long before energy efficiency became a modern concern. A house with well-managed firewood was a house that made it to spring. A house that burned fuel recklessly was a house that needed luck, and luck was not a sustainable heat source. But warmth was only one responsibility on fire's resume. Light mattered too. Without fire, winter darkness swallowed everything. The hearth fire, along with oil lamps and torches, provided the only illumination available. Fire allowed people to see each other's faces, repair tools, craft necessities, and avoid stepping on the wrong animal in the dark. Without it, the inside of a longhouse reverted to a shadow-filled cavern, waiting to trip its inhabitants at every step. Fire also powered cooking, and in winter, cooking wasn't a culinary hobby. It was survival chemistry. Frozen or dried food needed heat to become edible. Water needed heat to thaw from ice. Soups and stews simmered all day, releasing warmth that seeped into the very bones of the longhouse. Fire softened tough cuts of meat, made grains digestible, and transformed uninspiring roots into something that at least resembled food. Eating cold meals for too long wasn't just depressing, it wore down the body, making it harder to stay warm. Fire played an equally important role in tool maintenance. Wet or icy equipment had to be dried. Wooden handles needed warming to avoid cracking. Metal tools were heated for repairs, reshaping, or sharpening. The hearth essentially doubled as a winter workshop, where everyday objects received the warmth they needed to function. Without fire, tools failed, and when tools failed in winter, work stopped. When work stopped, survival became complicated fast. There was also fire's role in the emotional survival of winter, an aspect modern historians rarely emphasize but Viking families lived and breathed. Fire created a central gathering place, a literal and psychological anchor. People gravitated toward it not just to warm their hands, but to steady their minds. In a season when darkness pressed against the walls and hunger nibbled at everyone's nerves, fire's glow was a relief, a reminder that humans had at least mastered one thing in a world otherwise out of their control. Conversations happened around the hearth. Stories were told there, tasks were coordinated, arguments resolved, and comfort found. Fire gave winter structure. Without it, the house felt aimless, cold, and slightly terrifying. Even animals relaxed near the glow, contributing their own heat and occasionally blocking access to the best warm spots, which caused far more domestic disputes than Viking sagas ever recorded. But fire was not always friendly. Hearths could smoke aggressively if the wind shifted. Sparks escaped and threatened clothing, bedding, or wooden beams. Children needed constant supervision. One careless movement, one kicked ember, and the entire longhouse could turn from a warm sanctuary into a flaming disaster. That made fire simultaneously essential and dangerous, a paradox every household embraced because the alternative was far worse. Managing fire also required skill. Starting a flame in winter when wood was damp, winds were fierce, and fingers were stiff was a feat of experience and stubbornness. Maintaining that flame in a crowded home full of straw, wool, and people, that was a miracle repeated daily. Even the simple act of tending the fire required timing and finesse. Add too much wood, and the heat became overwhelming, wasting precious fuel. Add too little, and the cold crept in insidiously. In the Viking world, fire wasn't a luxury item. It wasn't something you enjoyed with a warm drink and a good story. It was the infrastructure of survival. Heat, light, food, tools, work, comfort, and community, all packed into a small circle of flames. Fire wasn't cozy. Fire wasn't charming. Fire was employed, full-time, no vacations, and utterly indispensable. If summer made the Viking world feel large, winter shrank it into a series of tiny frozen islands, each island being a village surrounded not by water, but by snowdrifts deep enough to bury an ox. Travel didn't simply become difficult, It became unthinkable. Villages that were a brisk morning walk apart in warm months suddenly felt located on different continents. Winter didn't just inconvenience communication, it rewired the entire geography. Snowfall was only the beginning. The real issue was accumulation. Snow didn't politely fall, melt, and repeat. It built itself into towering walls that transformed paths into obstacles and fields into blank white plains. A familiar road in August became a white mystery in January, erasing landmarks and creating the constant risk of wandering into a ditch, a river, or someone else's house accidentally. The world outside didn't become unfamiliar. It became impossible to interpret. Then came ice. Rivers that served as travel routes in warmer seasons froze into unpredictable highways, tempting, smooth, and lethally deceptive. Some stretches held solid as stone, others cracked without warning. A traveller could step onto ice feeling confident and vanish through it 2 seconds later, an experienced Vikings tried to avoid for obvious reasons. Frozen lakes and rivers were the ancient equivalent of shortcut with consequences, and of course storms completed the winter blockade. Winds howled across the landscape, turning snow into airborne knives. Blizzards reduced visibility to arm's length. A person could leave their home, walk 10 steps, and lose sight of everything, including their own sense of direction. Winter storms didn't respect human optimism. If you set out in one, you deserved whatever lecture your family gave you afterward, assuming you made it back alive. Because of these conditions, travel effectively paused. Trade routes shut down, markets fell silent, and messengers stayed home. Villages became closed ecosystems, living entirely off what they already had. News didn't travel, rumours didn't spread, gossip hibernated. If you wanted to know how your cousin in the next village was doing, you waited until spring or hoped a bird had overheard something interesting. Isolation was not a temporary inconvenience. It shaped community life profoundly. A village had to operate like a self-sustaining organism, relying on internal cooperation because no outside help was coming. If a tool broke, it had to be repaired with local materials. If someone fell ill, only local remedies were available. If a family's food ran low, the village had to negotiate how to support them without jeopardizing everyone else. Winter forced each community to become its own political, economic, and social microcosm. Inside these locked systems, roles became more important. A skilled carpenter, healer, or blacksmith was suddenly invaluable. They weren't just tradespeople, they were lifelines. If the only person who knew how to fix a critical tool got sick, it wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a village-wide crisis. Winter magnified the importance of every individual skill, turning daily work into a matter of communal survival. Social dynamics adapted too. With no new faces entering the village for months, people had to coexist with the same small group all winter long. Conflicts simmered or boiled depending on personalities, but they couldn't be escaped. You couldn't take a long walk to cool off unless you wanted to freeze halfway. So disagreements were handled with a degree of restraint not always found in Viking sagas. Winter encouraged diplomacy, not out of virtue, but out of necessity. The isolation also created a knowledge bottleneck. Information about the outside world didn't just slow, it stopped entirely. If a major event happened somewhere, an alliance formed, a chieftain died, a trading partner vanished, your village didn't hear about it until someone could physically walk the news over months later. Winter created a time delay on communication that modern people would find unbearable. Imagine hearing about a political shift 8 months after it happened and responding, "Oh, that explains the weird dreams we've been having." The psychological effects of isolation were just as real. With no travel, no visitors, and minimal connection to the outside world, villages entered a kind of social hibernation. People turned inward, focusing on their households, tasks, and survival routines. The world became small, measured in footsteps from the hearth to the barn to the snowy doorstep. Even the sense of time warped. Days blurred into one another, punctuated only by meals, chores, and the occasional argument when someone forgot to properly close the door and invited a blast of Arctic air inside. Children grew up believing that winter made the world shrink. They didn't see trade ships, distant travellers, or exotic goods. They saw the same buildings, the same faces, and maybe, if the weather allowed, a few brave sled rides in the snow. Their imagination had to carry them farther than their feet could. Yet despite all of this, winter isolation held certain advantages. Villages grew tighter. Shared hardships strengthened bonds. Quiet months allowed for long-term planning, crafting, storytelling, and reflection. The village moved at a slow, steady rhythm that made spring's arrival feel like the world expanding again in a sudden burst of colour and possibility. But the truth remained. Winter dictated the rules. It held every village in place like a frozen hand wrapped around the land. Because in the Viking world, winter didn't just create distance. It created separation so complete that unreachable became a seasonal reality. The modern image of Vikings often paints them as year-round marauders, fearless, unstoppable, and sailing across stormy seas with dramatic hair and perfect timing. Reality, however, was far more practical. Raiding and trading weren't constant activities. They were seasonal industries, carefully timed around the demands of the natural world. And winter shut them down completely. Not because courage ran low, but because physics stepped in, folded its arms and said, "Try it, I dare you." The Viking longship was a masterpiece of engineering, but even masterpieces have limits. Designed for speed, maneuverability, and shallow waters, these vessels were the sports cars of the medieval seas, impressive, sleek, and absolutely terrible at driving on ice. When winter arrived and coastlines froze or became clogged with drifting sea ice, longships turned from powerful tools into expensive decorations. No captain risked smashing the hull against frozen water, because repairing a ship in winter was about as realistic as growing fresh grapes. Ice wasn't the only problem. Winter storms in the North Atlantic were brutal, chaotic forces of nature. Waves rose like walls. Winds shifted unpredictably. Visibility dropped to a grey blur. Navigation depended on the stars and sun, but winter offered neither reliably. Attempting a sea voyage in December wasn't bold. It was a creative way to remove yourself from the gene pool. Even the most battle-hardened warriors understood that bravery didn't help when a wave rolled your ship upside down. And so, winter became the great pause in Viking mobility. Raiding halted, not for moral reasons, but because the environment turned the world into a giant no-sailing zone. Even the hardiest warriors stayed home, not because they lacked the desire to raid, but because frostbite, shipwrecks, and frozen harbours made their usual profession temporarily impractical. Winter humbled everyone equally. Trading followed the same pattern. Viking merchants, who travelled widely during warmer months, exchanged goods, established networks, and hauled items like furs, amber, iron, and walrus ivory across long distances. They were skilled negotiators, storytellers, and explorers. But winter forced them to become patient. The busiest crossroads of the Viking world turned silent. Foreign ports went months without seeing a northern ship. Markets froze as literally as the waterways that connected them. This pause created an economic rhythm. Summer and early autumn were the bustling seasons. Deals struck, goods collected, alliances negotiated. Winter, by contrast, was the time of inventory, not income. Traders spent these months examining supplies, planning future journeys, repairing equipment, and considering new opportunities. If you wanted to ask a merchant for advice or borrow something valuable, winter was the best time. They were home, indoors, and relatively stationary. For raiders, winter had a similar pattern of enforced rest. They returned home in late autumn, sharing spoils, retelling exaggerated stories, and resuming agricultural and domestic duties. Contrary to popular belief, Vikings weren't full-time warriors. They were farmers, craftsmen, sailors, and members of tightly knit communities. Winter made this clear. When the sea froze and travel stopped, everyone was reminded of their non-raiding identities. And winter rest didn't just benefit bodies, it benefited strategy. Planning a raid required much more than grabbing a weapon and shouting. Decisions had to be made about targets, crew, supply levels, and timing. Ships had to be maintained, tools repaired, weapons sharpened. Winter became the season of preparation, where future violence was organised with spreadsheets that didn't exist but absolutely would have if Vikings had known about them. This seasonal rhythm also meant that Viking raids were predictable to some degree. Coastal communities across Europe learned the pattern: danger in summer, relative safety in winter. This didn't stop raiders from being feared, but it did mean civilians could sleep a little easier during the cold months. The environment enforced a universal ceasefire, but halting mobility had social consequences. Raiders and traders, who spent much of the year exploring distant lands, suddenly found themselves confined at home. Some adapted well, others became restless. Households gained temporary extra labour, but also extra tension. You can imagine the frustration of a Viking warrior used to sailing and fighting suddenly stuck indoors all winter, helping sew sails and fix wooden tools, all while children used him as a jungle gym. Winter didn't just restrict travel, it reshaped personalities. Despite all this, winter didn't weaken Viking maritime culture. If anything, it sharpened it. The forced stillness allowed sailors to reflect on mistakes, adjust strategies, and prepare for the next opportunity. By the time warmer months returned, raiders were itching to travel, traders were eager to restart their circuits, and explorers were hungry for new horizons. Winter didn't diminish Viking ambition, it intensified it. The return of spring was nothing short of explosive. Harbours melted, rivers opened, the sea breathed again. Villages that had been quiet for months suddenly filled with activity as ships were dragged from shelters, repaired, loaded, and blessed for the coming season. It was a rebirth not just of nature but of mobility. The world expanded again, fast. Because for Vikings, raiding and trading weren't constant. They were seasonal migrations. And even the fiercest warrior knew there was no negotiating with an ocean that had become a solid, frozen wall. In the Viking world, winter didn't need to ask who was wealthy and who wasn't. It could tell. In summer, differences in status could be blurred by hard work, shared tasks, and the universal smell of sweat. But winter stripped away illusions. The cold had a talent for revealing the truth about resources, planning, and social standing. When temperatures dropped, status didn't just become visible, it became tangible, measured in degrees of warmth, thickness of clothing, and fullness of the food pile. Wealth wasn't displayed through jewellery or fancy carvings, though those existed. It was displayed in survival security. The richer you were, the less you suffered. The poorer you were, the more the cold treated you like a personal project. Winter turned inequality into a nightly performance, where everyone's comfort, or lack of it, played out in real time. The most obvious sign of wealth was clothing. A well-off family wore layers of high-quality wool, fur-lined cloaks, and footwear that actually insulated their feet instead of apologizing to them. Good clothes didn't just block wind, they preserved heat like precious treasure. Wealthy households could afford garments made from multiple materials: sheepskin for warmth, wool for breathability, and imported fabrics for added layering. Meanwhile, poorer families wore whatever they could patch together. Garments were repaired until the original cloth was just a rumour held together by newer repairs. A poor Viking might enter winter with clothing that worked decently, but by February it resembled a historical record of every snag, tear, and emergency mend from the last 10 years. The cold didn't care about fashion, but it certainly punished worn-out clothing. Wealth looked like warmth. Poverty looked like shivering. The next sign of status was living space. Wealthier families lived in larger longhouses with better insulation, more interior sections and larger hearths capable of sustaining steady fires. They had the manpower to harvest extra firewood in summer and the storage space to keep it dry. Their homes allowed heat to circulate through multiple rooms, and their hearths stayed lit almost continuously. Poorer households, on the other hand, experienced winter indoors the way someone might experience winter outdoors, slightly less lethal, but still very personal. Their longhouses were smaller, draftier, and more likely to leak heat with every gust of wind. Firewood was sometimes scarce, forcing them to ration it carefully, which meant long stretches in the cold. A poor family might gather around a hearth that produced more smoke than warmth, wrapped in blankets and hoping the wind didn't change direction again. But nothing revealed wealth more dramatically than food security. Winter meals were a form of wealth display. A wealthy family could serve thicker stews, larger portions, and occasional preserved meats that made the entire room smell like triumph. They could unseal barrels with confidence, knowing their supplies were adequate. They had enough to feed themselves, enough to share, and enough to maintain morale. Poorer households approached every winter meal with anxiety. Their portions were smaller, their variety limited, and their timeline more precarious. A guest at a wealthy home saw abundance. A guest at a poor home saw careful rationing. Running out of food wasn't shameful. It was simply common among the lower classes. But everyone knew who had entered winter with full stores and who had entered with crossed fingers. Then there was heat distribution, a surprisingly visible form of hierarchy. In winter, where you slept inside the longhouse mattered. The warmest spots near the hearth were generally reserved for those with status. Elders, heads of household, esteemed guests. Those of a lesser status slept farther away, where the cold settled like a permanent roommate. Wealthier households had enough bedding to keep warmth trapped, enough furs to distribute, and enough space to avoid overcrowding. Poorer families didn't have that luxury. They slept wherever there was room, often packed together for warmth like a pile of worried squirrels. Comfort wasn't an option. It was a dream held onto for spring. Even social interactions shifted during winter. Wealthy individuals had the confidence to host gatherings, share resources, and reinforce alliances. Their homes became centers of warmth, both physical and social. They could afford to be generous because their supplies allowed it. Hospitality in winter wasn't just kindness. It was a political act that strengthened social influence. Poor families visited others more often than they hosted, and when they did host, their hospitality was modest at best. No one expected extravagance, but everyone understood the silent weight behind offering a generous portion from a nearly empty supply. Tools and equipment also reflected winter status. Wealthy households had well-made axes, sturdy cooking pots, well-maintained bedding, iron hardware, and enough materials to make constant repairs. The poor often had tools repaired one too many times, bedding that barely insulated, and cooking equipment that performed its duties grudgingly. Winter amplified these differences because it demanded durability from everything: homes, clothing, tools, bodies, and spirits. Anything poorly made or poorly maintained became a liability. Wealth bought replacements. Poverty bought patience. And while Viking society valued strength, bravery, and reputation, winter reminded everyone that resources mattered as much as courage. A fearless warrior froze just as easily as a shy farmer if he lacked proper clothing. Winter was the great equalizer of biology, but the great amplifier of class. Class differences were always present in Viking society, but in winter they became visible at night, when the fortunate slept warm and the less fortunate slept close to survive. In the Viking world, clothing wasn't an expression of personality. It was a survival apparatus. Every tunic, cloak, mitten, boot, and fur-lined hat was a calculation in heat retention, durability, and practicality. Vikings didn't dress to impress. They dressed to avoid dying. Winter was a specialist in finding weaknesses, and clothing was the first line of defense. A tear wasn't a nuisance, it was a threat. A missing layer wasn't uncomfortable, it was dangerous. Clothing wasn't decorative, clothing was engineering. Wool was the undisputed champion of Viking winter survival. Not the gentle, soft wool you find in modern boutique scarves, but thick, sturdy, moisture-resistant wool that worked like nature's version of technical fabric. Wool could absorb moisture while still keeping the wearer warm, a miraculous property that ensured Vikings didn't instantly freeze the moment snow melted against their clothes. Wool tunics, wool trousers, wool cloaks. If a Viking wasn't wearing wool, it was because they were asleep or naked, and both situations were temporary. But wool alone wasn't enough. Vikings layered their clothing with the same strategic mindset they used when storing winter food. The first layer trapped body heat, the second blocked wind, the third repelled snow. And the outermost layer was often fur, practical, durable, and unapologetically warm. Fur linings around cloaks, boots, mittens, and collars created microclimates around the body. A well-made fur cloak could mean the difference between a cold walk and a fatal one. Fox, reindeer, wolf, bear. Whatever fur was available became armour against the cold. Boots were engineering marvels of their own. Winter footwear involved layers of wool, fur, leather, and stuffing like dried grasses for extra insulation. Vikings didn't have waterproof boots in the modern sense, but they had methods to keep moisture at bay: seal skin for outer layers, oil-treated leather, and tightly woven wool socks. Cold feet weren't merely unpleasant, they were an invitation for frostbite to introduce itself. Hands required the same attention. Mittens, warm, simple, and essential, were the preferred winter handgear. Gloves, with individual fingers separated, lost heat faster. Mittens kept fingers huddled together for warmth, like a small family trying to survive a winter storm. A lost mitten in January wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a tragedy worthy of its own saga verse. Head and neck coverings were equally critical. Wool caps, fur hoods, and wrapped textiles kept heat from escaping upward, because body heat, given the choice, prefers fleeing from the skull first. Vikings knew this instinctively. A bare head in winter was a sign of trouble, not toughness. No one admired your bravery if your ears froze off. What held all of this together, literally, was constant maintenance. Clothing repairs were a never-ending winter chore. A seamstress in the Viking world wasn't just a craftsperson, she was a structural engineer preventing heat leakage. Needles fashioned from bone or antler-stitched wool garments tightly. Loose threads were fixed immediately, not out of vanity but out of survival instinct. A ripped seam let cold air pour in like an unwelcome guest who refused to leave. Patching was a winter art form. Vikings reinforced worn elbows, knees and shoulders with extra wool or leather, extending the lifespan of precious clothing. These patches weren't fashionable. They were functional declarations of survival. If a tunic looked stitched together from 4 different original garments, all that meant was that its owner was smart enough not to freeze. Colour wasn't irrelevant, but it wasn't a priority either. Natural dyes created earthy tones, browns, greens, reds, yellows, but no one risked warmth for aesthetics. A stylish cloak that didn't retain heat was a stylish mistake. Ironically, the wealthiest had the most beautifully dyed garments not because they were vain, but because they could afford both colour and quality. The poor wore whatever they could salvage, repair, trade for, or inherit, even if it looked like it had survived 3 previous winters, and probably had. Children's clothing required particular care. Kids ran, climbed, tripped, slid, and otherwise tested the structural integrity of their garments daily. Parents patched children's clothing almost as frequently as children damaged it. A child going outside without proper clothing was a fast-track ticket to disaster. Winter didn't give discounts for youth. Specialized winter gear existed for specific tasks. Hunters wore extra layers of fur for long outdoor journeys. Travellers wrapped their legs in thick woolen puttees, cloth strips wound tightly to protect against windburn. Farmers clearing paths through snow wore heavier boots stuffed with insulating materials. Every task had its clothing solution, and every solution was built around staying alive. Because clothing wasn't just individual protection, it was household strategy. Families planned winter wardrobes as carefully as winter food stores. Who needed new boots this year? Who had outgrown their cloak? Which items could be passed down? Which needed to be traded for? A well-clothed family entered winter with confidence. A poorly clothed family entered with fear. Even the smell of winter clothing told a story. Smoke from the hearth, animal hides, lanolin-rich wool, and whatever fragrance the longhouse interior contributed that day. These smells weren't unpleasant to Vikings. They were the scent of warmth, the scent of survival. In the end, Viking winter clothing wasn't about beauty, elegance, or aesthetic appeal. It was about math, thermal math. Layers equaled warmth, repairs equaled longevity, fur equaled insulation, and any garment that failed its job risked the wearer's life. Fashion could wait for summer. In winter, insulation was the only trend anyone cared about. In the Viking world, winter wasn't just cold, it was an open invitation to every illness within a 100-mile radius. If warmth was scarce and food limited, health was even more fragile. Winter turned respiratory infections into unwelcome houseguests, transformed coughs into community-wide concerts, and turned a simple fever into a crisis. Illness didn't need to be creative in winter, it simply had to show up, and the season did the rest. The longhouse, for all its insulation benefits, created the perfect environment for sickness. Dozens of people and animals crowded together for months, sharing warmth, air, and germs in equal measure. Ventilation was limited by necessity. Too much airflow meant cold, too little meant stagnation. The result was a smoky, humid atmosphere where microbes flourished like enthusiastic partygoers at a festival no one wanted to attend. Respiratory infections hit especially hard. Coughing echoed through the longhouse at all hours. Deep coughs, dry coughs, stubborn coughs, and the occasional cough that made everyone turn their head and think, "That doesn't sound good." Vikings didn't understand bacteria or viruses, but they absolutely understood patterns. When one person started coughing in December, everyone expected to join in by January. Even minor illnesses could escalate quickly. A cold that might have resolved itself in summer became a prolonged struggle in winter. Why? Because winter sabotaged every part of the healing process. The body fought illness less effectively when underfed. Poor nutrition weakened immunity. Cold air strained lungs and airways. Rest was difficult when indoor air was thick with smoke, livestock noises, and the constant shuffle of life in tight quarters. Winter wasn't a medical condition, but it made every medical condition worse. Fever was particularly dangerous. Without ample water, hydration became a challenge. Without abundant fuel, being warm enough to sweat became a luxury. Fever dreams weren't just common, they were legendary. Stories were told of people seeing spirits, gods, or ominous shapes in the shadows during illness. Some believed sickness thinned the veil between worlds. In reality, they were just overheated, dehydrated, and lying next to a smoky fire in a dark room full of animals. Treatment options were limited. Healers relied on herbal remedies, teas, poultices, animal fat mixtures, and experience passed down through generations. Some treatments helped, others were optimistic attempts to look busy. Warm drinks soothed throats, steams opened airways, honey calmed coughs, but nothing cured the underlying issues because winter kept sabotaging progress. Even the best healer couldn't compete with a season determined to test everyone's mortality. Worse still, winter weakened people before illness even arrived. Hunger reduced strength. Cold stressed the cardiovascular system. The long hours of darkness affected mood and energy. Sleep cycles were erratic. All of this made bodies more susceptible to infection. Illness thrived not because viruses were strong, but because people were worn down. Children were especially vulnerable. Their developing immune systems struggled against winter illness, and parents watched anxiously whenever a child's cough deepened or fever rose. A child falling sick in winter wasn't just a family concern, it was a community concern. Neighbours checked in, offered advice, whispered prayers, or suggested remedies. But everyone knew that sometimes winter's grip was too strong. Elders faced similar risks. Their bodies couldn't fight infection as well, and the cold affected them more deeply. A simple cough could linger for weeks. Joint pain worsened. Fatigue grew heavier. Winter was a season where the old and the young lived closest to the edge, and everyone understood this without needing words. Even adults in their prime weren't safe. A warrior who survived battles and voyages could be brought to his knees by a chest infection. A strong farmer could lose weeks of productivity to an illness that refused to budge. Winter equalized strength. Muscles didn't help lungs. Courage didn't cure fever. Endurance helped, but only so much. Then there was the psychological toll of illness. Sickness fed isolation. It made people withdraw into blankets, huddle near the hearth, and listen to the relentless rhythm of their own coughing. Long periods of illness blurred time. Days merged, appetite faded, spirits dimmed. Winter sickness didn't simply attack the body, it wore down the mind. Communities adapted with rituals of care. Sick individuals were placed near the warmest spots. Extra blankets were allocated. Broths were prepared even when ingredients were scarce. People whispered encouragement. They tended fires with extra diligence. Sickness became a communal struggle because losing someone weakened everyone. Death, of course, was a possibility. A winter burial required logistical planning, breaking through frozen ground, braving harsh weather, and performing rites with numb fingers. When someone died in winter, the weight wasn't just emotional, it was physical. The entire community felt it. And yet, through it all, Vikings endured, not through medicine, but through resilience, through families watching over each other, through practical remedies, through the stubborn refusal to let illness claim more than it had to. Winter didn't create sickness. It simply rolled out the red carpet and told it to make itself comfortable. Winter didn't give Vikings a vacation. It gave them a new job description. When the fields froze, the soil hardened, and the daylight shrank to a polite whisper, people didn't stop working. They simply moved the battlefield indoors. Winter was the season where every postponed task, every slightly broken tool, every fraying garment, and every half-finished project returned like a roster of responsibilities that politely shouted, "Remember us?" The summer workload was loud and urgent. Planting, harvesting, tending livestock outdoors, repairing structures, maintaining fields. Winter work was quieter, but just as relentless. A never-ending series of tasks designed to prepare for the next warm season. Productivity didn't vanish, it changed rhythm. Winter was less about physical endurance and more about precision, maintenance, and foresight. The first major category of winter labour was tool repair. Farming tools, fishing equipment, weapons, ship gear, cooking implements, everything needed attention. Summer had worn them down with constant use. Handles loosened. Iron edges dulled, leather straps weakened, wooden parts cracked. Winter was the only time when people had both the indoor workspace and the available hours to fix everything properly. Inside the longhouse, the sound of scraping, sharpening, and tapping became winter's soundtrack. A farmer might spend hours repairing wooden ploughs and replacing worn pegs. A warrior would hone spear tips and axes until they could cut through anything that threatened next year's travel plans. Even children got involved, learning how to help with small repairs, slowly becoming part of the household's maintenance machine. Next came the world of textile work, an empire ruled by women whose winter workload rivaled every summer labourer combined. Weaving wasn't a hobby, It was the backbone of clothing, blankets, sails, belts, ropes, and bags. Winter was prime weaving season because the loom took up space, required focus, and fit perfectly into months spent indoors. Loom-weighted weaving was a complex process involving tension, patterning, and patience, qualities that winter supplied in abundance. Spinning wool into yarn was another winter task. It occupied hands during conversations, storytelling sessions, and moments of waiting. A well-prepared family emerged from winter with new garments, repaired old ones, and enough woven goods to trade when warm weather returned. Textile work turned cold months into a fabric factory, powered entirely by human effort and wool. Then there was woodworking, a craft that thrived in winter. Carvers shaped new spoons, bowls, handles, toys, and decorative items. Larger projects included replacing sections of furniture or planning improvements to the household structure. Wooden tools needed constant attention, and winter allowed for careful shaping and sanding by firelight. A well-made wooden tool wasn't just practical, it symbolized a household that invested in longevity. Boat maintenance also fell into winter's domain. Longships couldn't sail in freezing conditions, so winter became the season of inspection and repair. Planks were checked for damage, tar and pitch were applied to keep wood waterproof, ropes were replaced, oars were carved or smoothed. A neglected ship in winter meant disaster in summer. Every seam mattered, every missing nailhead received scrutiny. Vikings understood that the ocean rewarded preparation and punished arrogance. One of the most important winter tasks, though less visible, was planning. Household leaders gathered to assess resources, discuss future harvest strategies, manage livestock decisions, and evaluate what went well, or terribly, during the previous year. Winter gave people the rare chance to think, calculate, and organize. Decisions weren't rushed. They were discussed slowly by the hearth, taking into account weather patterns, soil conditions, trade possibilities, and the health of the household. Planning extended beyond practical matters. Marriages, alliances, trade partnerships, and voyages were also arranged during winter. These weren't spur-of-the-moment choices. They were long-term strategies for survival and prosperity. Winter's harshness made people realistic. Emotional decisions rarely survived the cold. Practical decisions thrived. Winter also brought opportunities for craftsmanship. Carved ornaments, jewellery, bone tools, combs, and needle cases were created during these months. Such items were not luxuries. They were trade goods, tokens of respect, and tools for everyday life. A household that crafted well in winter had an easier time bartering in spring. Entertainment, too, was shaped by work. Storytelling wasn't just recreation. It was a communal act that kept the room lively while hands continued working. You could sharpen a knife while listening to a saga. You could spin wool while hearing your uncle embellish a hunting story that definitely hadn't happened exactly the way he claimed. Work fused with culture. Winter became the season when traditions passed from one generation to the next, all while projects steadily progressed. Children participated as well. They learned sewing, carving, knot tying, and basic repair. Winter was a school of necessity, teaching skills that would carry them through adult life. Instead of textbooks, they had tools. Instead of classrooms, they had a crowded longhouse. Instead of exams, they had the expectation that their work kept the household alive. All this effort wasn't glamorous. Winter work was repetitive, meticulous, and sometimes monotonous. But it was essential. Every polished spear tip, every woven cloth, every repaired tool contributed to the coming spring. Winter wasn't dead time. It was investment time, where future seasons were built one stitch, one scrape, one decision at a time. You didn't farm in winter. You fixed everything you'd ignored for 6 months straight. When the Viking world tilted into winter darkness, entertainment became as vital as firewood. With daylight reduced to fleeting slivers and storms sealing everyone indoors, people needed something to fill the long, heavy hours, and storytelling became the heartbeat of winter life. Stories weren't merely ways to pass the time. They were cultural lifelines, emotional outlets, and occasionally creative escapes from the crushing boredom of staring at the same 15 faces day after day. Winter storytelling wasn't optional, it was woven into nightly routine. Families gathered close to the hearth where warmth was strongest, the fire casting shifting patterns on the walls and creating an atmosphere that was equal parts cosy and eerie. The smoke rose in slow layers, making the room feel half real, half dream, perfect for tales of gods, monsters, and impossible adventures. When the world outside was silent and frozen, the world inside came alive with voices, gestures, drama, and imagination. The storytellers varied. Some were skilled skalds, trained poets with memory banks full of verse and structured saga. Others were elders whose stories blended history with embellishment. And sometimes, the storyteller was simply the most talkative person available, determined to keep the room awake with a tale regardless of its quality. Whether the story was glorious or questionable, everyone listened because it beat staring into the darkness and wondering whether spring had forgotten to arrive. Sagas thrived in winter. Some were recited in strict poetic form, each line structured to maintain rhythm and meaning. Others were sprawling epics, recounted in episodes like evening installments of a long-running drama. Heroes fought giants, gods meddled in mortal affairs, ships braved impossible seas, lovers took impossible risks, warriors made impossible decisions, and everyone in the longhouse listened intently, swept into worlds that felt larger than the confined space around them. Myths grew in the dark months because winter demanded them. When the environment made life feel small and restricted, stories expanded the mental universe. A saga could transport listeners to distant shores, mythical realms, or moments of ancient bravery. A good story made winter less suffocating. A great story made the season feel almost magical. Almost. Children absorbed these stories eagerly. Winter was their classroom of fantasy and history combined. They learned the lineage of gods, the cunning of heroes, and the tragic fates of those who defied cosmic fate. They memorized verses, repeated phrases, and lived temporarily in worlds where danger was exciting, not cold and immediate. The storytelling tradition ensured that culture passed down not through writing, but through memory, emotion, and voice. And winter gave that tradition all the time it needed to breathe. But storytelling wasn't all grandeur and myth. Winter was also the season for humour, because laughter was one of the few renewable resources available. People told jokes, shared embarrassing stories, and exaggerated their accomplishments with creative flair. Tall tales grew a little taller each year, especially when boredom, an unseen collaborator, encouraged storytellers to add flair where facts were thin. Someone who had once caught a modest fish might describe it during winter as a beast the size of a child. Someone who had once escaped a fox might retell the event as battling a demon beast in the darkness. Winter encouraged dramatic storytelling not because people were deceptive, but because it made the time pass faster. Boredom didn't just build mythology, it built comedic legends too. Storytelling also served a deeper function, strengthening community bonds. Winter forced people into close quarters, and stories acted like social glue, smoothing tensions and reminding everyone that they shared the same hardships and hopes. A longhouse without stories was a longhouse filled with silence, and silence made the walls feel closer, the nights longer, and the cold sharper. Stories kept minds warm even when bodies weren't. Not all stories were ancient. Some recounted events from the village itself, local gossip, heroic mishaps, tragic losses, or particularly outrageous behaviour that happened earlier in the year. Winter provided the perfect stage for these stories to undergo editorial revisions, often to the embarrassment of whoever starred in them. Reputation management was difficult when your unforgettable moment became the winter's favourite anecdote. The atmosphere of winter storytelling was unmatched. Imagine a crowded hall lit only by fire, everyone wrapped in layers, animals shifting quietly in the background, and the sound of wind pressing against the walls. Into this space stepped the voice of the storyteller, steady and confident. Words cut through smoke. Faces turned toward the speaker. Even the fire seemed to hush when a dramatic moment arrived. For many Vikings, stories offered emotional endurance. Winter was long, repetitive, and psychologically challenging. Stories gave structure to evenings, something to look forward to after daily chores. They also reminded listeners of identity, purpose, ancestry, and values. Through stories, people remembered that the world was wider than the frozen landscape outside. And so, winter became the unofficial storytelling festival of Viking life. A season when imagination warmed rooms, when epics were practiced and perfected, when children learned to carry tales into the next generation. Without winter, Viking mythology might still exist, but it would be smaller, less polished, less central to culture. Because when there was nowhere to go and nothing to see but darkness and snow, stories became the escape hatch. Boredom didn't just build mythology, it built the entire Viking narrative tradition. Winter didn't just test the Viking body, it tested the Viking spirit. When cold gnawed at bones, storms erased paths, and darkness stretched endlessly, people naturally looked beyond the physical world for reassurance. If summer encouraged confidence in one's own strength, winter encouraged humility. It reminded everyone that survival was never guaranteed, and in that humbling awareness, the gods felt closer than ever. For Vikings, religion wasn't theoretical. It wasn't tucked away in temples or debated by scholars. It was lived, breathed, and woven into daily survival, especially in the cold months, when hardships made divine influence feel immediate and personal. Winter carved away illusions of self-sufficiency, leaving space for belief to grow louder, richer, and more urgent. Offerings increased as the cold deepened. A small portion of meat, a cup of ale, a bit of grain. These were precious in winter, and giving them up didn't symbolize abundance, it symbolized need. Offering food during scarcity wasn't generosity toward the gods. It was a plea for mercy. People didn't just ask for warmth or safety. They asked for winter to end on time, for storms to spare their homes, for illnesses to loosen their grip. The gods were addressed as helpers, protectors, and sometimes negotiators in a season where nature offered no compromises. Households practiced rituals that had been passed down for generations. Some involved spoken prayers, rhythmic and repetitive, designed to bring comfort even if the results were uncertain. Others involved symbolic actions, burning herbs, lighting specific types of candles, carving small idols, tying protective knots in clothing, or sprinkling ale onto the hearth fire. The hearth, after all, was the centre of winter existence, and offering something to its flames felt like sending a message upward, carried by smoke toward attentive divine ears. Fear and faith intertwined effortlessly. A violent storm wasn't just weather, it could be interpreted as the anger or presence of Thor. A sudden break in the clouds could be a sign from Freya. A fortunate recovery from illness might be credited to Air's favour. When you lived months surrounded by darkness and danger, you didn't wait for dramatic omens. Small changes felt meaningful. A slightly warmer day, a surprisingly calm night. The survival of a weak animal. These moments were interpreted through a religious lens. Winter stories often blended faith with explanation. Children heard tales of gods enduring hardships far worse than anything mortals faced. Odin's search for wisdom, Freya's tears for her missing husband, Thor's endless battles with frost giants, literal embodiments of winter's cruelty. These stories served not only as entertainment, but as reassurance. If gods fought winter monsters, then mortals enduring cold were part of a cosmic struggle that heroic beings also confronted. Belief also shaped communal rituals. During the darkest weeks, some villages held ceremonies meant to bless the community and encourage the return of sunlight. Fires were lit to push back spiritual darkness. Songs filled longhouses, their rhythms carrying hope even when the air felt too heavy for optimism. The Yule season wasn't simply a feast, it was a spiritual strategy, a way to pull warmth and light into the heart of winter through symbolic action. Faith also amplified during moments of crisis, when firewood stocks ran low, when food tasted like disappointment, when illness struck, prayers became louder and more frequent. People spoke to the gods under their breath when setting logs on the fire, hoping the wood would last longer than logic predicted. When stirring thin stew, they might murmur a request for tomorrow to somehow be better. When stepping outside into the cold wind, they might whisper Thor's name just to steady their courage. But faith wasn't only about fear. Winter also created moments of connection, a sense that the gods weren't distant but intimately involved in daily life. The quiet moments in a longhouse, when fire crackled gently and everyone listened to the wind outside, felt sacred. The silence carried weight, as if unseen forces were watching, not with malice but with witness. People felt guided, accompanied. The stillness of winter made divine presence feel more pronounced. This closeness influenced decision-making too. Before setting out to gather wood or tend to animals in dangerous storms, people sought divine favour through small gestures or whispered invocations. Before distributing food, they thanked the gods for what remained. Before major winter decisions, whether to butcher another animal, whether to ration more strictly, whether to treat a sickness with a last portion of herbs, leaders often made symbolic gestures to seek wisdom. And in a season where everything moved slowly, faith filled the empty spaces in time. There was room for contemplation, reflection, storytelling, and ritual repetition. People remembered ancestors, honoured traditions, and connected their own struggles to those who had survived harsh winters before them. Faith became less about individual belief and more about belonging to a lineage of survivors carried through by ritual and memory. The gods didn't solve every problem. Winter was too relentless for miracles to act as shortcuts. But belief helped people endure, and endurance was the key to survival. Faith provided structure when daylight failed. It provided comfort when illness lingered. It provided courage when storms battered the walls. And when the horizon finally brightened in spring, when sunlight returned with surprising gentleness, people greeted it not just with relief but with gratitude, because they believed they hadn't survived alone. In the Viking world, winter didn't weaken faith. It amplified it. Because when firewood ran low, prayers rose high. In the Viking world, fear wasn't shameful. It wasn't weakness. It wasn't a dramatic emotional display. Fear was a tool, as essential to winter survival as firewood and warm clothing. Winter demanded a level of caution so precise, so persistent, that reckless behaviour wasn't heroic, it was suicidal. The season stripped bravado from even the fiercest warriors, leaving behind something much more valuable: practical fear. Unlike the wild, adrenaline-driven fear felt during raids or battles, winter fear was slow, silent, and intelligent. It sat in the back of the mind, monitoring every decision. Whispering reminders: is that safe? Is that smart? Are you sure? It didn't escalate the pulse, it sharpened awareness. In winter, fear put on a pair of reading glasses, reviewed your choices, and politely suggested you not ruin your life today. Every Viking learned early that winter punished impulsivity. One poorly timed outing, one misstep on ice, one misjudged distance, and the consequences were immediate and irreversible. Fear wasn't the problem. Lack of fear was. The bravest person in the village often became the coldest body in the snow. This wasn't theoretical. Winter created daily opportunities to make fatal mistakes. Distant chores, like checking traps, gathering wood, or tending to animals, required careful planning. You didn't just step outside because you felt like it. You calculated wind direction, cloud movement, snow depth, daylight time, and whether your boots were properly layered. Leaving home without thinking was a summer habit. In winter, It was a farewell tour. Experience became the winter compass. Elders weren't just respected for age. They were respected for wisdom accumulated through dozens of winters. They'd made mistakes, seen what those mistakes caused, and survived to talk about them. Their advice wasn't philosophical. It was brutally practical. Don't walk on new ice unless you want to meet the river personally. Don't chase a startled animal. You'll tire before it does. Don't go far when the snow squeaks. Squeaky snow means extreme cold. Don't trust anything in winter, especially your own optimism. Winter taught people to treat the environment as a cunning opponent. Snow could hide holes, ice could disguise weakness, darkness could erase familiar landmarks. Even a task as simple as walking to a neighbour's house required caution. You didn't boast about being swift, you boasted about returning. Risk-taking plummeted, not because people lacked courage, but because courage wasn't functional. Survival required patience. Vikings practiced what could be called seasonal humility, understanding the limits of the human body and the superiority of the elements. In winter, arrogance wasn't a personality flaw. It was a weather-related hazard. Even warriors, the icons of bravery, changed their behaviour. Men who would charge into battle without hesitation looked at a blizzard and said, "Not today." The cold didn't care about how many enemies you defeated or how loudly you could shout. Winter didn't respond to intimidation. It responded to preparation, discipline, and respect. Inside the longhouse, fear was a quiet presence. Parents taught children caution not with threats, but with matter-of-fact reminders. Don't wander, don't touch burning logs, don't go near the door without an adult. Their goal wasn't to scare children into obedience. It was to socialize them into winter logic. Logic that said safety isn't luck. Safety is discipline. The psychological shift was almost ritualistic. As soon as winter arrived, people entered a different mindset, one rooted in restraint. Tasks slowed down. Decisions were deliberate. Movements were subdued. Even arguments tended to soften because shouting wasted heat, energy, and emotional bandwidth. Winter made everyone pragmatic, intentional, and slightly risk-averse in the healthiest possible way. This wasn't a season for bold experiments either. No one tested out new building materials, unproven cooking methods, or ambitious repairs. Winter was not the time to reinvent anything. Tradition ruled, because tradition was based on methods tested by generations who had already argued with winter and lost. Travel plans became more conservative as well. Journeys that were trivial in summer became logistical operations requiring escorts, supplies, backup plans, and more than one person who could navigate by feel rather than by sight. If someone insisted on travelling alone in the cold, the village responded with a mix of concern, disbelief, and the resigned understanding that some people insisted on learning the hard way. Animals also shaped winter caution. Livestock could behave unpredictably in cold weather, forcing people to approach them carefully. Frozen ground caused slips. Snow-muffled sound, masking approaching danger. If a predator came near the village, visibility was too poor to track it effectively. Fear didn't overreact. It kept people alive. Even the fire demanded respect. Fear reminded everyone not to fall asleep without tending the hearth properly, not to leave embers unguarded, not to let children get too close. Winter turned every small hazard into a potential catastrophe. Fear simply sharpened awareness of that reality. What made Viking winter fear so unique was its lack of drama. No one ran around panicking. No one broke down. Fear wasn't emotional. It was procedural. A built-in safety system. A low hum, not a scream. It didn't destabilize people. It anchored them. This calm fear wasn't cowardice. It was expertise. It kept families alive, tools intact, and communities functioning through months of weather that tested human endurance relentlessly. Winter made bravery step aside and let caution take the lead. Because in the Viking world, bravery was for battlefields. Winter required something far wiser. Bravery took the winter off, and fear handled the schedule. In the Viking world, children didn't grow up in a bubble. Winter made sure of that. Childhood was not an age of sheltered innocence. It was an apprenticeship in survival. Every cold month delivered lessons that were immediate, unforgiving, and unforgettable. Winter didn't wait for adulthood to teach its harsh curriculum. It taught children early because their survival depended on understanding the rules long before they were fully grown. The first thing Viking children learned about winter was respect, not the polite kind, but the wary, instinctive respect one develops around something that could kill you. Cold wasn't a mood, it was a force. Children quickly understood that winter wasn't bad weather. It was an annual adversary that demanded cooperation from even the smallest members of the household. Their first lessons were physical. Babies were swaddled tightly, not just for comfort but for insulation. Toddlers quickly discovered what cold felt like, and adults didn't downplay it. If a child wandered too close to an open door, a parent would pull them back with the kind of urgency usually reserved for dangerous animals. Frostbite wasn't a metaphor, it was a real possibility. Children heard warnings like, "Keep your fingers covered," or "Don't lick that," far more than "Go play outside." Still, children did go outside. Winter didn't cancel outdoor chores, it just made them more supervised. A child might help carry small bundles of firewood, gather snow to melt for water, or check on animals alongside an adult. These were not symbolic tasks assigned to give children a sense of purpose. They were real contributions. A family's survival relied on many hands, even tiny ones. Children learned to dress themselves properly from astonishingly young ages. Older kids helped younger siblings with their layers: wool underpieces, thicker outer layers, fur-lined mittens, cloaks pinned securely with brooches, hoods tied tight. Forgetting a layer wasn't an adorable childhood mistake. It was a danger adults corrected instantly. A child stepping outside with exposed skin would be intercepted before the cold even had time to bite. But winter education wasn't solely about the body. It also shaped children's minds, their expectations, and their understanding of the world. Winter taught discipline. Food was limited. Children learned portion control not as a rule but as a necessity. You didn't complain about what was served. You didn't ask for more when there wasn't more to give. You ate what you were given and learned to be grateful for it. Hunger taught patience before children could spell the word. Winter also taught responsibility. Every member of the household had a job, and children were no exception. Some carried firewood, some tended embers, some swept snow away from the door, some churned butter or helped stir stew. These tasks weren't busy work, they mattered. A child who slacked off wasn't scolded for laziness, they were warned about consequences. Responsibilities weren't tied to age, they were tied to capability. Loss, too, touched children more often than modern people might imagine. Winter claimed animals. Sometimes it claimed elders. Children witnessed grief up close. They learned that death was not an abstract fear, but a tangible outcome of winter's severity. Families didn't shield children from this reality. They integrated them into rituals of care, remembrance, and resilience. A child watching a burial in frozen ground understood winter deeply. It was powerful, impartial, and unforgiving. Yet winter didn't create joyless childhoods. It simply made joy resourceful. Children adapted their play to the environment. Indoors, they carved wooden toys, practiced simple weaving techniques, or invented games that required imagination rather than space. They played with bones and sticks the way modern children play with plastic figurines. They mimicked adult chores in miniature, often turning them into competitions: who could gather kindling fastest, who could help prepare bedding most efficiently. Outdoors, on calmer winter days, children revelled in snow with the same enthusiasm seen today. They slid down small hills, leapt into drifts, and learned quickly how deep snow could swallow a small child whole. Adults kept watch, not to ruin the fun, but to ensure the frost didn't ruin the child. Viking kids didn't fear winter, but they acknowledged it like a strict teacher who occasionally allowed recess. Storytelling nights were particularly important for children. These evenings fed their imaginations and reinforced cultural identity. Winter myths featuring frost giants, snow demons, or brave heroes subtly doubled as safety lessons. The tales taught courage, yes, but also caution, cleverness, teamwork, and respect for the unknown. Children absorbed these values not because someone lectured them, but because the stories made sense in a world where darkness and cold pressed against the walls. Sibling relationships were shaped by winter too. Older children became protectors and educators, guiding younger siblings through the routines, how to bundle up, how to help with chores, how to stay warm at night, how to avoid trouble. This built a sense of responsibility and unity. Families were survival units, and children grew up understanding their place within that structure. Perhaps the strongest lesson Viking children learned was self-awareness. Winter forced them to understand their limits, but also their strengths. They learned how to endure discomfort without despair. They learned that giving up wasn't an option, not because adults demanded toughness, but because winter demanded cooperation. By the time a Viking child reached adulthood, winter had already shaped their character. Caution, resilience, responsibility, and an intimate understanding of the natural world were instilled through experience, not instruction. Winter wasn't a season they survived occasionally. It was a tutor that returned every year, offering the same lessons with increasing intensity. In the Viking world, childhood wasn't sheltered. It was sharpened. And if adults warned, "Don't get frostbite," it wasn't a joke. It was an annual reminder. When winter locked Viking villages into immobility, it didn't only trap people inside their homes, it trapped their personalities too. And personalities, when confined in a smoky wooden box with 30 other humans, had a habit of colliding. Conflict didn't vanish during winter. It simply found new battlefields, cramped rooms, shared chores, and the delicate art of navigating close quarters living without losing your temper. If summer revealed strength, winter revealed patience, or the spectacular lack of it. Longhouses were warm, yes, but warmth came at the cost of space. Families didn't just sit near each other, they existed practically on top of one another. There were children bumping knees, elders claiming the warmest spots, livestock shifting in nearby stalls, and adults weaving, carving, cooking, repairing, advising, arguing, reminding, scolding, sighing, coughing, and occasionally attempting to quietly escape to a corner that didn't exist. Under these conditions, it's no wonder that tensions rose like steam from the hearth. The first type of conflict was simple irritation, the kind born from hearing the same voice, the same cough, the same snore, the same complaint for weeks on end. Cabin fever wasn't a psychological concept for Vikings, it was a daily reality. The longhouse amplified every sound, including the ones no one wanted to hear. You couldn't politely walk to another room to clear your head. The other room was usually occupied by 3 people having their own argument. Even small annoyances grew teeth in winter. Someone chewing too loudly, offense level, high, someone stepping on your foot in the dark, serious grievance, someone leaving the door slightly open and letting in the cold, a moment worthy of legend. If you wanted to start a feud in winter, all you had to do was let the wind inside. But irritation wasn't the only source of conflict. Winter magnified hierarchy. In longer daylight months, tasks were spread out across different environments. Men were in the fields, women along the looms, children doing chores outdoors, elders supervising activities. Winter collapsed these roles into one house. Here, authority became visible and immediate. The head of the household issued instructions constantly. Chop more wood, tend the fire, repair this, clean that, keep the children quiet, move the goat, don't burn the stew, and for the love of the gods, stop arguing next to the water barrel. Leadership in winter required consistency, fairness, and an uncanny ability not to scream. A respected leader kept a household coordinated. A poor leader created chaos. And chaos indoors was much worse than chaos outdoors. There was nowhere to run. Winter discipline also intensified. Children were restless and loud by nature. Winter didn't change that, but it changed how adults responded. A child misbehaving in summer might be sent outside or distracted with tasks. In winter, there was no outside. Disobedience felt amplified by the close quarters. Adults corrected behavior quickly, sometimes sternly, because one disruptive child could unravel the fragile order required to survive winter peacefully. Discipline wasn't harsh for the sake of power. It was survival psychology. When resources were tight, tempers thin, and sleep inconsistent, households needed clear structure. Rules kept the peace. Routines kept sanity. Ignoring either risked turning the longhouse into a pressure cooker. Conflicts between adults, however, could be the louder storms of winter. Disagreements about food distribution, workload fairness, firewood rationing, and treatment of animals were common. Couples argued about responsibility. Siblings argued about space. In-laws argued about everything. And because there was no privacy, everyone heard everything, whether they wanted to or not. Sometimes, arguments became theatrical events. A heated dispute over something trivial, like who took the last piece of dried fish, could become entertainment for everyone else trapped indoors. People listened with sympathy, curiosity, or thinly disguised amusement. But even then, these arguments rarely escalated into chaos. The reality of living together forced disputes to resolve faster than they might in summer. Winter made grudges exhausting. Hierarchy enforcement spilled into interpersonal disputes. If someone stepped out of line, an elder might step in with a sharp remark or stern glare. Respect for age carried weight in winter, especially when elders remembered harsh seasons from decades past. Their voices shaped behavior, diffused tension, or ended arguments with a single sentence like, "We survived worse winters with less complaining. Sit down." There were also conflicts over resources: firewood, bedding, warm spots near the hearth, tools, and even storytelling time became subtly contested spaces. Who got the warmest seat? Who got extra blankets? Who got first turn at the repaired tool? These decisions reflected family dynamics and sometimes created friction. Winter forced households to negotiate these micro-conflicts daily. Compromise wasn't optional, it was oxygen. Peace wasn't a passive state, it was actively maintained. Yet winter conflict wasn't always negative. Sometimes arguments ended in laughter, shared memories, or realizations that stress, not malice, was at the root. When families were trapped together, they became experts in forgiveness. Winter taught people to get over things quickly. Holding grudges was too exhausting when everyone slept less than 10 feet from each other. Moreover, conflict had an emotional purpose. It let people release tension. It reminded them they were still human, still passionate, still alive. In a season that tried so hard to silence vitality, even arguments were proof of resilience. At the end of winter, when daylight stretched longer and doors finally opened without protest, families emerged stronger, or at least relieved. Having survived storms, illness, hunger, and each other, they gained a renewed appreciation for personal space. Because winter didn't eliminate conflict, it concentrated it. And family bonds weren't just tested, they were stress-tested by snow, darkness, and close quarters. In the Viking world, winter didn't just challenge life, it revealed its fragility. Death, which in summer could sometimes be held at a respectful distance, became an uninvited, unavoidable presence in the cold months. Winter sharpened mortality into something visible, tangible, and painfully ordinary. It was not a poetic transition or a grand farewell. It was a season where life felt thin, where danger surrounded families on all sides, and where death became part of the landscape. First, winter elevated the risk factors that already hovered over daily life. Hunger weakened bodies, illness spread rapidly. Cold compromised endurance. Accidents were more common. A fall on ice, a misjudged walk home, a mishandled tool. Any of these could tip the balance from recovery to tragedy. People didn't fear death abstractly. They feared the conditions that created it. And in winter, those conditions intensified. Death was more present not because winter was malevolent, but because winter was thorough. Weak animals died. Elders succumbed to illness or exhaustion. Sick children struggled to recover. Even healthy adults could be undone by factors outside their control. A broken bone healed slowly in freezing temperatures. A fever lingered too long. A cough deepened into something ominous. Winter chipped away at strength, one breath at a time. The visibility of death was also startlingly physical. In summer, burials were straightforward. Dig, prepare, honour, mourn. But in winter, the earth itself resisted grief. Ground froze into stone. Tools bounced off hardened soil. Sometimes a burial required hours of labour from multiple people wielding axes, shields, and hands wrapped in layers of wool. Some communities carved out burial mounds before winter arrived, because breaking frozen earth in January bordered on impossible. In extreme conditions, burials had to be postponed. Families might keep bodies preserved in the cold until the ground softened, a practical, heartbreaking adaptation. Death in winter wasn't simply painful, it was logistically difficult. Funerals were shorter, quieter affairs. Rituals were adapted to harsh weather. A blizzard didn't pause for mourning. Mourners endured the storm as best they could. Winter made every burial a battle. The psychological toll of this constant closeness to death was profound. Grief didn't have space to dissipate. It clung to people, layered like frost. In a longhouse filled with the living, the absence of someone lost was deeply felt. Their sleeping space became conspicuously empty. Their chores became someone else's burden. Their voice ceased to echo through the halls. In a season where families needed every hand, every breath, every spark of warmth, each loss felt magnified. Even children absorbed the reality of winter mortality. They learned early that life could vanish unexpectedly. Adults didn't shield them from this truth. Instead, they taught them how to endure loss, how to honour the dead, and how to continue moving forward despite grief. Winter hardened children not emotionally, but existentially. They grew up understanding that life was brief, precious, and perpetually vulnerable. For adults, death carried a heavier philosophical weight during winter. The darkness outside became a mirror of internal uncertainties. Long nights offered too much time to think about loved ones gone, about personal weaknesses, about the delicate balance between life and environment. Storytelling helped fill silence, but even stories acknowledged winter's role in shaping fate. Myths of frost giants and cosmic struggles weren't just entertainment, they were reflections of the environmental forces people grappled with daily. Winter also influenced how people interacted socially. When mortality felt close, people often softened toward one another. Conflicts resolved more quickly. Acts of kindness multiplied. A shared understanding settled over communities. Survival was collective, and loss was communal. Each death affected the group, prompting others to adjust routines, support grieving families, or redistribute responsibilities. Winter didn't just claim lives, it rearranged them. And yet, even in this season of harsh truths, Viking spirituality offered frameworks for understanding loss. Belief in the afterlife, whether Valhalla, hell, or other realms, provided emotional scaffolding. People whispered to the dead, honoured them through ritual, and trusted that their spirits continued elsewhere. Religion didn't erase grief, but it softened its edges. Winter made death feel inevitable, but belief made it feel meaningful. Still, winter stripped the drama from death. There were no heroic battles, no poetic last stands. People died quietly, at home, under blankets, surrounded by family, often without ceremony. Death was mundane, it was a pattern. and that unromantic nature made it more profound. Winter reminded everyone that grand stories were only part of life. The rest was endurance, hope, and acceptance. This is why spring carried emotional weight that went beyond warmth. When the first patches of sunlight lingered longer on the horizon, when the snow began to melt, when the air felt gentle rather than sharp, people breathed deeper. Spring was not just a season. It was reassurance, a confirmation that winter had not won. It meant renewal, relief, and a temporary reprieve from the presence of death. Winter taught Vikings that mortality was intertwined with existence. Spring reminded them that life too could return. In the Viking world, winter didn't politely wait until summer to become relevant again. The moment people realized they would survive this winter, they immediately began worrying about the next one. Planning wasn't a seasonal task. It was a perpetual mindset, an ongoing cycle of preparation that repeated year after year because winter never forgot to show up. You didn't finish winter. You simply completed one round and started training for the rematch. This long-term thinking wasn't optional. It was wired into Viking culture as firmly as the grain roots in their fields. Survival demanded that every household, not just the wealthiest, not just the most organized, but everyone, look ahead months, sometimes years. Winter's eventual return shaped decisions made in spring, summer, and autumn. It shaped travel plans, food strategies, building projects, and agricultural choices. Winter was the invisible advisor present at every conversation. Even in the heart of the cold season, when storms rattled the longhouse and daylight was a theoretical concept, people used their quiet hours to plan. They took stock of what the household still had, what it had lost, and what needed improvement before the next cold season. The questions never stopped. Did we chop enough firewood? Did our preserved food last as long as expected? Did the roof leak? Did our clothing hold up? Did any tools fail? Did the livestock manage the cold well enough? Did we prepare too much of one food, not enough of another? Families discussed these problems openly because the consequences of ignoring them were painfully clear. Winter had no mercy for households that failed to learn from mistakes. A poorly constructed roof might sag under heavy snow. A badly insulated wall could drain heat. A weak cow that barely survived might not make it next time. Planning wasn't an abstract concept. It was survival accounting. Even as people sat by the hearth, mending garments or repairing tools, they mentally catalogued what would need crafting or replacing before winter returned. Every problem encountered during the cold months sparked a solution for the next one. A cloak that kept slipping off. Next year add a better fastening, a tool that cracked. Next year make 2 backups. Firewood supply dwindled too fast. Next year gather more or choose better logs. The moment the first hints of spring melted the snowdrifts, planning accelerated. The ground thawed, the animals grew restless, and families emerged into the fragile warmth ready to fix everything winter had scrutinized. The melting season revealed damages that couldn't be seen in winter. Broken fences, warped doors, cracked beams. Spring wasn't relaxation. It was inspection season. Spring also determined what food would exist next winter. Fields were prepared early, seeds sown as soon as soil allowed, and grazing planned to maximize future pasture health. Crops weren't planted casually. They were chosen with precise knowledge of what had run short during winter. If the barley stores fell too fast, more barley would be grown. If turnips proved reliable lifesavers, more turnips went into the earth. Livestock management followed the same pattern. Families tracked which animals weathered the cold well and which struggled. Calves born strong were invested in. Weak animals were looked at critically. Keeping them might be sentimental, but sentiment didn't survive winter. Decisions were made with long-term benefits in mind, because preparing for winter required both emotional discipline and strategic thinking. Household structure adapted yearly as well. A drafty corner discovered in January needed reinforcement by June. A chimney that smoked too aggressively required redesign before frost returned. Viking homes were living structures, constantly improved to tighten defences against the cold. A family might spend weeks that summer digging deeper insulation, replacing roof thatch, adding sturdier beams, or reshaping interior walls. Planning extended into social life too. Winter revealed which families struggled and which thrived. Spring became the season when communities redistributed obligations, adjusted alliances, or offered assistance. A household that nearly ran out of food needed support not out of pity, but because next winter's survival affected everyone. Trade agreements were reshaped. Cooperative tasks like building communal structures or repairing roads were prioritized early so winter wouldn't catch the village unprepared. Even celebrations carried strategic implications. Summer feasts weren't just joyful expressions. They were opportunities to evaluate neighboring households, negotiate shared grazing rights, establish winter plans, and exchange information needed to survive. No Viking ever drank ale in summer without thinking, somewhere deep inside, about how many barrels of ale would be reasonable to preserve for when the cold months returned. Children were part of winter planning too. Training them to weave, carve, tend animals, or chop wood wasn't merely education, it was investment. A child proficient in winter tasks meant one more capable pair of hands when the season demanded it. Every adult in the household understood they were not simply passing down knowledge, they were building a team. The emotional impact of constant preparation was immense. Winter hovered like an ever-present shadow, even on the warmest days. But this didn't burden Vikings with dread. Instead, it sharpened their resilience. Planning gave them control. It turned fear into practicality. It turned uncertainty into action. By late summer, preparations intensified again. Drying racks filled, storage pits were checked, roofs were patched one more time, just in case. Livestock were evaluated, tools were sorted, and the quiet, familiar ritual of counting supplies began. The same questions from winter returned in anticipation of the next. Do we have enough? What are we missing? What must be done before frost returns? And when autumn arrived, planning ended and execution took over. Harvesting, preserving, slaughtering, repairing. Everything escalated as winter approached again like a debt collector with perfect punctuality. Because in the Viking world, surviving one winter didn't grant relief, it granted clarity. And the moment you survived, you started preparing to survive again. In the Viking world, reputations weren't built in the heat of battle. They were built in the cold of winter. Summer victories were impressive, yes, but winter competence was legendary. A person could be brave in war, generous at feasts, or charming at gatherings. But if they lost their composure when snow buried the landscape and supplies dwindled, their social standing dropped faster than the temperature. Winter survival wasn't just a household concern. It was a public performance of leadership, discipline, foresight, and self-control. The season created a kind of social scoreboard. People watched how others managed their resources, how calmly they endured hardships, and how well they prepared months in advance. A competent leader wasn't judged by grand speeches or ostentatious displays, but by quiet, consistent preparation. Winter exposed the truth about people. It showed who planned carefully, who shared wisely, who rationed well, and who caved under pressure. And the community remembered. This wasn't superficial judgment. In winter, one person's poor planning could affect everyone else. If a household ran out of food too early, neighbours had to decide whether to share precious supplies. If someone mismanaged firewood, the village risked becoming a burden on itself. If a leader failed to organise communal tasks, like clearing paths, reinforcing structures, or organising livestock care, everyone would pay the price. Winter didn't allow anyone to hide incompetence behind charisma. Reputation therefore grew from three core qualities: preparation, stability, and generosity. Preparation. The most respected individuals were those who seemed to know winter intimately, as if they had whispered conversations with the frost and negotiated terms with the storms. They stocked food meticulously, cut firewood early, repaired tools before the first snowflake arrived, and calculated exactly how much their households needed to survive. They never appeared frantic. Their calmness wasn't arrogance, it was earned confidence. If someone said they're ready for winter, it wasn't a casual compliment. It was a statement of character. Preparation signaled wisdom, discipline, and reliability. Even enemies respected a well-prepared household. Stability. Winter tested emotional endurance. Leaders who remained steady when supplies dipped or storms raged earned admiration. Panic was contagious in enclosed spaces, and a leader who panicked didn't just disturb their own household, they destabilized the entire community. But someone who stayed calm in the face of hardship, who spoke reassuringly, who made logical decisions, who maintained routines, became a human anchor. Winter rewarded people who didn't fall apart when conditions got grim. Steadiness kept fires burning, chores moving, and spirits from collapsing. A calm leader turned a terrifying blizzard into an unpleasant inconvenience rather than a harbinger of doom. Generosity. Oddly enough, in a season defined by scarcity, reputation flourished through acts of giving. Sharing food, lending tools, offering warm spaces, bringing help to a neighbor with illness. These gestures shaped how people viewed a household. Generosity wasn't flamboyant, it was strategic kindness. Helping a weaker family survive winter strengthened the entire community. People remembered who shared and who refused. Those who hoarded without reason or displayed selfishness during the cold months were quietly marked. They might have had resources, but they lacked winter honor. A wealthy household could lose prestige if it acted cold-hearted when the world was already cold enough. Winter reputation was multi-generational. The stories of how people behaved in winter were passed down. Children grew up hearing which ancestors had held their households together, which leaders guided villages through harsh seasons, which individuals had shared during famines, and which had cracked under pressure. These stories weren't gossip, they were cultural memory. A family's winter legacy carried enormous weight in determining its standing. It wasn't uncommon for someone to say his grandfather kept 3 families alive through a terrible winter, and for that one sentence to overshadow almost everything else. Winter created legends quietly, without drama or spectacle. Leadership was measured by shelves, not words. In summer, anyone could make promises. In winter, promises were useless if they weren't supported by full granaries, sturdy roofing, and well-maintained tools. A leader could inspire people with confidence, but if their storage shed was empty by midwinter, nobody cared how inspirational they were. Winter leadership was practical leadership. Did you have enough supplies? Did your household stay warm? Did you distribute tasks wisely? Did you help the vulnerable? Did you make difficult choices without crumbling? Did you think ahead? These questions mattered far more than combat skills or eloquent speeches. The cold didn't care for poetry. Panic was socially expensive. People who panicked, who rushed decisions, who wasted firewood, who overate supplies, who argued loudly, who made impulsive choices, were silently noted. Not because panic was shameful, but because panic was dangerous. A panicker was a liability. Their household became unpredictable. Their actions increased everyone's anxiety. Winter demanded calm, not chaos. Communities leaned on steady individuals, those who remained rational even when the ice cracked ominously, or when illness swept through families. Calmness was leadership. Predictability was strength. Emergence in spring. When spring finally arrived, people didn't just celebrate the return of warmth. They evaluated how everyone had done. This seasonal assessment shaped alliances, marriages, trade agreements, and even political influence. A family that thrived through winter gained prestige. One that barely scraped by might lose standing, and one that fell apart entirely altered the village dynamic permanently. Survival wasn't just about bodies making it through winter, it was about reputation making it through winter. Because in the Viking world, winter wasn't merely weather, It was a leadership exam with no retakes, and the highest compliment anyone could receive was simple. Their shelves were full, and so were their neighbours. The Viking mindset wasn't an accident of geography or personality. It was a direct result of living under a seasonal regime that demanded strength, clarity, and a healthy respect for things outside human control. Winter shaped how Vikings thought, planned, believed, and behaved. It carved their worldview with the same precision that ice carved the landscape. The northern cold wasn't just a backdrop to Viking life. It was the architect of their mentality. To understand the Viking psyche, you must understand winter, not just as weather, but as a force that imposed its values onto every decision. Resilience wasn't inspirational, it was required. The Viking sense of resilience wasn't heroic self-help wisdom. It was a practical response to a season that punished weakness. When winter came, it didn't matter how tired you were, how discouraged you felt, or how unfair circumstances seemed. You had no choice but to continue. You had to wake up, stoke the fire, manage chores, care for animals, ration food, and keep morale steady. Quitting was not an option. Winter demanded participation from everyone, every day. This constant pressure created a worldview where resilience was not celebrated. It was expected. Vikings didn't complement each other for enduring hardship. Endurance was the baseline. Praise came only when someone exceeded that baseline, and even then the compliment was usually understated. The Viking style of admiration was something like, "He handled that storm well," which translated emotionally to, "That man is practically a demigod." Realism became a cultural cornerstone. Winter erased illusions. If summer encouraged dreams, winter encouraged strategies. Optimism could survive the season, but only if it learned to dress warmly and pack provisions. Vikings didn't indulge in wishful thinking about weather patterns, harvest success, or divine intervention. They hoped, yes, but they also planned, prepared, and assessed risks carefully. This realism showed up everywhere. Art and poetry blended beauty with brutality. Sagas didn't sugarcoat fate. They delivered harsh truths with poetic flair. Everyday conversation treated danger as normal, not dramatic. Vikings grew up in an environment where pretending things were better than they were could cost lives. So they valued honesty, directness, and practicality. Realism became their intellectual default setting. If someone said, "Winter will be mild," the typical response wasn't excitement, it was suspicion. No one trusted optimism without evidence. Fatalism wasn't pessimism, it was strategy. Vikings are often described as fatalistic, believing in destiny, luck, and the inevitability of hardship. But this wasn't cultural gloom. It was an adaptation to a world where nature routinely outpowered human effort. Winter taught Vikings that not everything could be controlled. A storm could ruin travel plans. Illness could strike without warning. Game animals could vanish. Ice could crack. A blizzard could last longer than anyone expected. When so many factors lay outside human influence, the smartest approach was to accept unpredictability and work around it. This acceptance produced a cultural fatalism that made Vikings remarkably calm in crisis. If disaster struck, they didn't freeze in shock. They pivoted, they adjusted, they kept moving. Fatalism wasn't hopelessness. It was emotional efficiency. Strength and grit became social values. Winter rewarded mental toughness. Grit mattered more than glamour. A person who complained constantly was seen as unreliable, because emotional instability could snowball into poor decision-making. Someone who kept a level head and did their work even when conditions were miserable earned quiet admiration. This value system shaped expectations. Men were taught to be stoic, not because emotions were shameful, but because winter didn't allow emotional paralysis. Women were equally respected for endurance. Spinning, weaving, cooking, rationing, and caring for families during the darkest months required its own formidable strength. Children grew up learning that self-control wasn't just polite, it was protective. Grit wasn't macho posturing, it was survival-level maturity. Humour survived, but it adapted. The Viking sense of humour was witty, dark and understated, because winter sharpened it. When the environment regularly delivered life-threatening conditions, humour became a pressure valve. But winter humour didn't deny harshness. It acknowledged it in clever, ironic ways. Jokes were often dry observations about misfortune, ill-timed events, or the absurdity of daily survival. A Viking might joke, "The good news is the snow stopped. The bad news is I can't feel my legs." Not because it was funny in a modern sense, but because humour helped people endure without collapsing. Winter didn't kill optimism. It forced optimism to grow a backbone. Planning became personality. Because winter dominated existence, Vikings developed a mentality oriented toward foresight. They valued people who could plan months ahead, anticipate problems, and think through consequences. The ability to prepare wasn't a skill, it was a personality trait, one that signalled intelligence and reliability. A person known for poor planning wasn't mocked, they were feared. Their lack of foresight could endanger others. Meanwhile, a meticulous planner gained respect, trust, and influence. Winter taught everyone that a poorly timed mistake could cost the entire household a season's worth of effort. Community bonding had a winter edge. The Viking mindset also included a strong sense of community cooperation. Winter made isolation deadly. People depended on each other to survive, and that interdependence shaped social values. Sharing became honourable. Cooperation became instinct. Disputes weakened the group, so they were resolved quickly. Winter forced individualism to make room for collective survival, creating a mindset where strength was measured not only by personal abilities, but by how well one supported the group. Mindset. Summary: winter built the Viking brain. By the time spring arrived, Vikings weren't simply survivors of the cold. They were shaped by it mentally, emotionally, and culturally. Winter carved them into resilient, realistic, forward-thinking people with humour that could withstand darkness, fate that accepted uncertainty, and discipline that kept communities alive. Winter didn't just change their behaviour, it forged their worldview. Optimism survived winter, but only after learning caution first. Winter wasn't just a season in the Viking world, it was the master scheduler, the cultural architect, the annual test of preparedness, and the ever-present shadow behind every decision. It shaped behaviour, values, beliefs, work rhythms, and fears so thoroughly that Viking identity itself grew out of the need to endure it. When you look at the Viking worldview, its toughness, its practicality, its humour, its fatalism, you're looking at people shaped by a climate that left no room for illusions. This final chapter isn't about freezing winds or long nights or snowdrifts deeper than your dignity. It's about what winter did to the people who survived it. It sculpted them. Winter was the most democratic force in Viking life. Everyone, from the strongest warrior to the youngest child, faced the same bitter cold. Winter didn't care about fame, wealth, fearlessness, or poetic skill. It treated everyone equally. The chieftain's nose turned red just as fast as the farmer's. The only advantage wealth provided was better insulation. No one was immune to the season's scrutiny. This shared vulnerability built cohesion. Winter created unity because it forced everyone to acknowledge a simple fact. You don't survive this alone. That truth became the backbone of Viking society. Cooperation wasn't a preference, it was infrastructure. Resilience wasn't bragged about, it was expected. People depended on each other because winter depended on nobody. Winter turned survival into skill, not luck. Surviving winter wasn't a stroke of fortune, it was evidence of competence. Every household that made it through had done so because of Preparation months in advance, emotional endurance, realistic planning, measured decision-making, community support, and the relentless discipline winter demanded. When families emerged in spring, they weren't just relieved, they were affirmed. Winter was proof. It was validation. A surviving household had demonstrated mastery over a hostile environment. This is why winter fundamentally shaped identity. It wasn't just something endured, it was something achieved. The Viking sense of pride, which gets misunderstood as arrogance, came from this regular confrontation with nature at its harshest. If you survive winter every year, you develop a quiet confidence that's impossible to fake. Winter forced Vikings to understand limits and strengths. Winter humbled everyone. If summer encouraged ambition, winter enforced boundaries. The cold told you where your limits were, how far you could walk, how long you could wait, how little you could eat, how much you could carry, how well you could stay calm in crisis. But winter also revealed strengths. It showed who could stay composed when things went wrong, who could lead without panicking, who could take responsibility without collapsing, who could sacrifice without resentment. It showed who the reliable ones were, the ones who could be counted on. It made the Viking world profoundly aware of human fragility, but equally aware of human resilience. You learn to respect both. Winter built the cultural values we now call Viking toughness. What do we associate with Vikings? Endurance, courage, practicality, commitment, dark humor, loyalty, acceptance of fate, deep respect for nature, and a certain philosophical stoicism. These didn't appear out of thin air. They weren't random traits. They were winter's curriculum. Year after year, season after season, winter drilled these values into everyone until they became cultural identity. Even when Vikings traveled to warmer lands, these traits stayed with them because they were built for a world that demanded psychological armor. Winter wasn't just a season they endured, it was the culture that raised them. Winter was the storyteller of the North. Everything from sagas to myths to customs reflects winter's influence. The gods battled frost giants. Heroes braved snow and darkness. Rituals revolved around light returning. Family stories were told by firelight. Lessons were passed down in the cadence of cold nights. Even humor had a winter edge. Dry, sharp, understated, and unbothered by discomfort. Winter wrote Viking mythology as much as any school ever did. It gave them the tools to imagine worlds of harshness, bravery, danger, and endurance, because they lived in one already. The good news and the bad news. Here's where winter's legacy becomes clearest. Surviving it gave Vikings a sense of accomplishment unmatched by any battle glory. Making it to spring meant that every decision, every repair, every ration, every piece of clothing, every fire tended, every argument resolved, and every fear respected had mattered. You survived winter because you earned it. But survival wasn't a final victory, it was temporary. When the days grew longer and snow melted into mud, Vikings didn't celebrate as if winter had been defeated forever. They celebrated because they had a brief pause before doing it all again. The arrival of spring didn't erase winter. It simply meant tools must be repaired, food supplies must be restocked, livestock must be strengthened, roofs must be fixed, clothing must be rewoven, strategies must be revised, and preparation must resume. In the Viking world, winter wasn't an enemy you defeated. It was a force you respected, a teacher that gave no praise, a judge that offered no explanations, a cycle that never stopped returning. The good news? You survived the winter. The bad news? Winter will be back.